Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. When I was 14 years old, my girlfriend Mira and I spent the summer at my grandparents' house in the rural countryside. The isolation of their property, surrounded by dense woodlands and forgotten dirt roads, felt like the perfect backdrop for teenage adventures. We had been dating for 6 months, and like most couples our age, we were eager to prove our courage to each other and ourselves. The idea came to us on a particularly stifling August evening in 2015. The air hung thick and motionless, and the old farmhouse creaked with every slight movement. Mira and I sat on the front porch, swatting at mosquitoes and listening to the distant howl of coyotes echoing through the trees. That's when she suggested it. A test of courage in the middle of the night, an excuse to explore some abandoned and creepy places we'd heard whispered about in town. "Come on," she urged, her dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "We can't spend the whole summer sitting around doing nothing. Where's your sense of adventure?" I knew she was right, though something in my gut twisted uneasily at the thought. Still, at 14, the need to impress her outweighed any reasonable caution. We decided to ask my grandfather if he knew of any abandoned places nearby, somewhere with a reputation, somewhere that would make for a proper challenge. Grandpa Roy was sitting in his worn leather recliner, the evening news casting blue shadows across his weathered face. When we approached him with our request, his expression grew serious, and he muted the television with deliberate slowness. "There's a place," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "About a kilometer south of here, through the old growth forest, there's an abandoned house and cabin that's been empty for decades." He leaned forward, his rheumy eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The house belonged to a man named Roger Thornfield. Came here from Ohio sometime in the early 1900s. Built that place with his own hands, lived there alone for years. Then one day he just vanished. Never heard from again. Nobody knows what happened to him." The way Grandpa told the story, with his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, sent an uncomfortable shiver through me. But Mira squeezed my hand, and I could see the excitement building in her expression. "What do you mean, vanished?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I mean gone without a trace. Food still on the table, bed still warm, but Roger Thornfield was nowhere to be found. The authorities searched for weeks. Some folks say he just got tired of the isolation and moved on, but..." Grandpa's voice trailed off, and he shook his head slowly. "That man loved that place more than anything. He wouldn't have just left it behind." We were skeptical of the story, naturally. Mira and I weren't strong believers in ghost tales or supernatural nonsense. We figured it was just another local legend, embellished over the decades until fact and fiction had become hopelessly tangled. The mystery only made the place more appealing as a destination for our midnight adventure. My grandparents, predictably, were adamantly against our plan when we revealed our intentions the next morning. Grandma Helen nearly dropped her coffee mug when we told her, and she immediately launched into a lecture about the dangers of wandering through the forest at night. "Absolutely not," she declared, her voice brooking no argument. "That forest is full of wild animals, unstable terrain, and God knows what else. You two are not going out there in the dark." But like most teenagers faced with adult disapproval, we saw their concerns as challenges to overcome rather than wisdom to heed. We spent the rest of the day planning our expedition in secret, gathering supplies and waiting for the household to settle into sleep. By 11:30 that night, the farmhouse had fallen quiet, except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and Grandpa's occasional snores drifting from the master bedroom. Mira and I had agreed to meet by the old oak tree at the edge of the property, each of us sneaking out through our respective bedroom windows. The night air was cooler than expected, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something else, something organic and decay-sweet that I couldn't quite identify. We had armed ourselves with what we considered essential equipment. 2 hunting knives borrowed from Grandpa's workshop, 2 heavy-duty flashlights, and several extra battery packs. In retrospect, our preparations seem laughably inadequate, but at the time we felt like seasoned explorers. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered as we stood at the forest's edge, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the wall of darkness between the trees. Mira nodded, though I noticed her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted her grip on her own flashlight. "We've come this far. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? It's just an old house." Those words would come back to haunt me later, but in that moment, her confidence was infectious. We plunged into the forest, following what appeared to be an old game trail that headed roughly south according to my compass. The forest seemed to close around us as we walked, the canopy so dense that even our powerful flashlights created only small pools of visibility in the suffocating darkness. Every step produced a symphony of sounds: the crunch of dead leaves, the snap of twigs, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. But beneath these natural sounds, I began to detect something else. A subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite name. It started as a feeling, a growing certainty that we were not alone in these woods. The sensation began as a tickle between my shoulder blades, the instinctive awareness of being watched that every human possesses. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more frequently, sweeping my flashlight beam in wide arcs behind us, but finding nothing except more trees and deeper shadows. "Do you hear that?" Mira whispered after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. I stopped and listened carefully, straining my ears against the ambient noise of the forest. At first I heard only the expected sounds of nocturnal wildlife, but then I caught it. A subtle disturbance in the natural rhythm of the woods. It sounded almost like footsteps, but not quite. The timing was wrong, and the spacing between the sounds suggested something moving with deliberate stealth. "Probably just a deer," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. We continued forward, but the feeling of being observed only intensified. Several times I could have sworn I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that shifted when it shouldn't have, a flash of something pale between the trees. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there except the endless repetition of tree trunks and darkness. The forest itself seemed to be holding secrets, and the deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and carried strange scents that changed with each gust of wind. Sometimes it smelled like rotting vegetation, other times like something metallic and sharp, and occasionally like burning wood, though we saw no signs of fire. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, we spotted the first signs of human habitation. A crumbling stone wall that emerged from the undergrowth like the backbone of some buried giant. The stones were covered in thick moss and lichen, and several had tumbled down, creating gaps that looked disturbingly like missing teeth in a skull's grimace. Following the deteriorating wall led us to a clearing that opened up like a wound in the forest's flesh. In the center stood the house that Grandpa had described, but seeing it in person was far more unsettling than I had anticipated. The structure was indeed a typical American farmhouse from the early 1900s, but time and abandonment had transformed it into something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The white paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wooden siding exposed to decades of weather. What remained of the paint hung in strips like diseased skin, fluttering in the slight breeze with a sound like whispered conversations. The front porch sagged dramatically on one side, supported by makeshift posts that looked ready to collapse at any moment. Several windows were broken, their glass teeth catching our flashlight beams and throwing distorted reflections back at us. But it was the overall presence of the house that truly disturbed me. Even in its decay, the building possessed a malevolent quality that seemed to emanate from its very foundation. The dark windows watched us like empty eye sockets, and the partially open front door hung ajar like a mouth caught mid-scream. "God, that's creepy," Mira breathed, and I noticed she had moved closer to me, close enough that I could feel her trembling. We approached the house slowly, our footsteps unnaturally loud on the overgrown path. The porch steps groaned ominously under our weight, and I half expected them to give way entirely, but they held. The front door was unlocked, or more accurately, the lock had long since rusted away, leaving the door free to swing on its corroded hinges. The interior of the house assaulted us immediately with the smell of mold, decay, and something else, something organic and sweet that made my stomach turn. Our flashlight beams revealed a living room frozen in time, furniture still arranged as if Roger Thornfield had simply stepped out for a moment and might return at any time. But it was the additions to the room that truly disturbed us. The walls were covered in graffiti, but not the typical vandalism of teenagers. These markings were deliberate, methodical, carved deep into the wood with sharp implements. Some were symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing shadows cast by our flashlights. Others were words in languages that looked ancient and threatening. We moved through the house room by room, each space revealing new horrors that seemed designed to assault both our sanity and our senses. In what had once been the kitchen, we found books scattered across every surface. But these weren't normal books. They were texts on demonology, witchcraft, and ritual magic, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. Some were written in English, others in languages I couldn't even begin to identify, but all shared a common theme of darkness and forbidden knowledge. The illustrations in these books were particularly disturbing. Detailed anatomical drawings showed human figures in various states of dismemberment, while other pages depicted creatures that seemed to exist at the intersection of nightmare and reality. The artwork was skillfully done, which somehow made it even more unsettling. These weren't the crude scribblings of a madman, but the careful observations of someone who believed deeply in what they were documenting. In the dining room, we discovered paintings hanging on the walls that defied explanation. They depicted scenes of rural life, but twisted into something fundamentally wrong. Farmers working fields where the crops appeared to be made of human hair. Children playing games that involved dismembered animals. A family dinner where the food on the table was clearly not meant for human consumption. The paintings were executed with technical skill, but the subject matter was so disturbing that I found myself unable to look at them directly for more than a few seconds. There was something in the brushwork itself that seemed to suggest movement, as if the scenes were not static images but windows into actively unfolding horrors. But the dolls were the worst of all. Every room we entered contained them, arranged in groupings that suggested some sort of purpose or ceremony. They were antique dolls, the kind with porcelain faces and glass eyes, but someone had modified them in ways that transformed innocent children's toys into objects of pure terror. Some had been dismembered and reassembled incorrectly, with limbs attached at impossible angles. Others had their faces repainted to show expressions of agony or rage. Still others had been stuffed with what looked like human hair and animal bones, their seams splitting to reveal the grotesque contents within. The doll's eyes seemed to track our movement as we passed, though I knew it was just an optical illusion created by the angle of their glass pupils. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things, and I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure none of them had moved. In the master bedroom, we found the most disturbing display of all. A collection of dolls arranged around what had once been the bed, their positions suggesting they were attending some sort of ritual or ceremony. At the center of the arrangement was a single doll that was different from the others, larger, more realistic, and wearing what appeared to be human clothing that had been carefully tailored to fit its proportions. After 20 minutes of exploring the house, we had seen enough. Both Mira and I were badly shaken, but we had committed to investigating both the house and the cabin, and teenage pride demanded that we follow through on our promise. We forced ourselves to exit the house and make our way across the clearing toward the wooden cabin that stood about 50 feet away. The cabin was smaller than the house, built from logs that had weathered to a deep gray color that seemed to absorb the light from our flashlights. Unlike the house, which felt actively malevolent, the cabin radiated a different kind of menace. Something quieter but no less threatening. It squatted in the shadows like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. As we crossed the space between the two buildings, I became increasingly aware of the sounds around us. The normal nighttime symphony of the forest had fallen silent, creating a vacuum of noise that felt unnatural and wrong. Even the wind had died away, leaving the air still and heavy with an electric tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was during this crossing that I first heard the voice. "Over here." The words were spoken clearly, distinctly, in a tone that was neither male nor female, but something in between. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on air that moved without wind. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering against my ribs as I swept my flashlight beam across the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mira, but she was already several steps ahead of me, apparently unaware that anything had happened. "Hear what?" she called back, turning to look at me with confusion. I wanted to explain, but something prevented me from speaking. The voice had triggered a response in my brain that felt almost primitive, a recognition of danger that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the most basic survival instincts. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to get away from this place as quickly as possible, but I found myself unable to move. It was then that I noticed the small mound of concrete near the base of a large oak tree. It was roughly rectangular, about the size of a grave, and someone had etched symbols into its surface that were similar to the ones we had seen inside the house. The concrete was old and cracked, with weeds growing through the fissures, but the symbols remained clearly visible. I approached the concrete mound against my better judgment, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't understand or resist. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, requiring enormous effort to overcome an invisible resistance that seemed to emanate from the mound itself. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand began to shake, casting dancing shadows that made the carved symbols appear to writhe and shift. When I reached the edge of the mound, I stopped as if I had walked into an invisible wall. Every muscle in my body locked up simultaneously, freezing me in place with my flashlight pointed down at the mysterious concrete rectangle. I tried to call out to Mira, tried to move my legs, tried to do anything other than stand there like a statue, but my body refused to obey my commands. The symbols on the concrete began to blur and swim before my eyes, and I felt a strange sensation of falling, even though I knew I was still standing upright. The world around me started to dim at the edges, as if someone was slowly turning down the lights in my peripheral vision. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming smell of earth and decay, as if I was standing at the edge of a freshly dug grave. Then there was nothing. Complete, absolute blackness that swallowed my consciousness entirely. When awareness returned, it came slowly and painfully, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark pool. My first sensation was of cold, bone-deep cold that seemed to have settled into my very marrow. My second was pain, a throbbing agony that started at the base of my skull and radiated outward through my entire head. I opened my eyes to find myself lying face down in the dirt, approximately 10 feet from where I had been standing when I lost consciousness. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, though the beam was now dim and flickering as the batteries struggled to maintain power. The taste in my mouth was horrible, metallic and bitter, like I had been chewing on old pennies. Panic set in when I realized I couldn't see Mira anywhere in the immediate vicinity. I pushed myself up to my hands and knees, fighting off waves of nausea and dizziness, and began searching for her with my failing flashlight. The beam swept across the clearing, illuminating the house, the cabin, the trees, but no sign of my girlfriend. It was then that I heard a low moan coming from the direction of the cabin. I forced myself to my feet, swaying dangerously as my equilibrium struggled to reassert itself, and stumbled toward the sound. I found Mira lying unconscious about 20 feet from the cabin entrance, face down in a patch of dead grass that surrounded the building like a cancer. Her flashlight had rolled several feet away and was still functioning, casting a steady beam that revealed the alarming pallor of her skin. When I reached her, I could see that she was breathing, but her respiration was shallow and labored. "Mira," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Mira, wake up." She stirred at my touch, then suddenly came awake with a violent jerk, her eyes wide and filled with terror. The scream that erupted from her throat was raw and primal, the sound of someone who had seen something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. "Leave us alone!" she shrieked, scrambling backward across the ground with her hands and feet, her eyes fixed on some point behind me. I spun around, expecting to see whatever had terrified her, but found only the empty clearing and the dark shapes of the buildings. When I turned back to her, I saw that her face had taken on a sickly pallor that made her look like she was suffering from some terrible wasting disease. Her skin had a grayish tint, and her eyes were rimmed with dark circles that hadn't been there before our adventure began. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside her and trying to keep my voice calm despite my own mounting terror. "What did you see?" "There was a man," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been following us since we entered the forest, watching us. I saw him when I woke up. He was standing right behind you, just watching." I looked around again, more carefully this time, but saw nothing that could be described as human. The clearing remained empty except for the two of us and the ominous buildings that loomed in the darkness. Mira was in no condition to walk, so I helped her climb onto my back and began the terrifying journey back through the forest. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and every sound made me jump and nearly lose my footing. The weight of my girlfriend on my back made progress slow and exhausting, but adrenaline and desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. The journey back felt both eternal and impossibly brief. We crashed through the underbrush, following our earlier trail when I could find it, and blazing new paths when I couldn't. My flashlight batteries finally died completely about halfway back, leaving us to navigate by the faint moonlight that occasionally penetrated the forest canopy. When we finally emerged from the tree line near my grandparents' property, I was shocked to discover that virtually no time had passed since our departure. My watch showed 11:39 p.m., only 1 minute after we had entered the forest, despite what felt like hours of exploration and travel. I called my Uncle Roy from the landline in the kitchen, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that we needed immediate transportation to the nearest hospital. He arrived within minutes, his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness like twin blades. The look on his face when he saw Mira's condition was one of barely controlled fury mixed with genuine fear. During the frantic drive to the emergency room, I tried to explain what had happened, but my uncle cut me off with a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. "You two are lucky to be alive," he finally said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Other people have tried to investigate that place over the years. Some came back hurt, some came back changed, and some—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his implication was clear. At the hospital, doctors found that Mira had suffered what they termed blunt force trauma to her head, though neither of us could remember any impact that might have caused such an injury. The wound required 12 stitches and left a permanent scar that she carries to this day, a curved line along her left temple that serves as a constant reminder of our encounter with whatever dwells in those woods. We never spoke of that night again, not to each other and certainly not to anyone else. Some experiences are too profound, too fundamentally disturbing, to be shared through mere words. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to move on their own, I still think about that voice calling my name and the concrete mound that held secrets too terrible to uncover. We're both adults now, with families and responsibilities and rational explanations for most of the world's mysteries. But we've never returned to any abandoned places, and we never will. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again, and some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. The forest still stands, and the house and cabin remain abandoned, waiting for the next curious souls brave enough or foolish enough to test their courage against whatever dwells in the darkness between the trees. Growing up in Cedar Ridge, Utah in 2019, I learned that some places exist at the intersection of civilization and emptiness. Our house occupied the final lot on Juniper Street, where pavement surrendered to wild grass and endless desert. At 17, I thought I understood the landscape around me, but the vast fields stretching toward distant mountains held secrets I wasn't prepared to uncover. My bedroom window faced east, offering a view of rolling terrain that seemed to breathe with the wind. During summer afternoons, heat mirages would dance across the ground, creating phantom lakes that vanished when you looked directly at them. The optical illusions should have been my first warning about how easily this place could deceive the eye. My closest neighbor, Jake Martinez, lived in the only other house on our dead-end street. His family had moved here 3 years earlier, and we'd become inseparable despite our different backgrounds. Where I was cautious and analytical, Jake was impulsive and fearless. His basement became our sanctuary, equipped with gaming consoles, a mini fridge, and furniture that had seen better decades. The basement's single window well faced the empty cul-de-sac that marked where town planners had once envisioned expansion. Instead of new neighborhoods, the area remained undeveloped, creating a half-finished circle of asphalt that led nowhere. During daylight hours, the incomplete road seemed harmless, even amusing. But as darkness fell, that broken pavement transformed into something that made my skin crawl. Jake's parents worked evening shifts at the regional hospital, leaving us unsupervised most nights. We'd settle into our routine of gaming marathons and junk food, but I found myself increasingly distracted by sounds drifting through that basement window. Initially, I attributed the noises to wildlife or wind-blown debris. The desert supported various nocturnal animals, and identifying every sound seemed impossible. However, certain disturbances didn't fit typical animal behavior patterns. A rhythmic scraping would emerge from the darkness, followed by what resembled labored breathing or choking sounds. These episodes occurred irregularly, sometimes multiple nights in succession, then vanishing for weeks. The unpredictability made them more unsettling than any consistent pattern would have been. By late August, the strange nocturnal activities had established a disturbing rhythm. Jake and I developed an unspoken protocol whenever the sounds began. Pause whatever we were doing, exchange worried glances, and strain our ears for additional clues. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge how these incidents were affecting our sleep and concentration. The sounds defied easy categorization. Sometimes they resembled someone dragging heavy objects across rough ground. Other times we'd hear what could only be described as wet, gurgling vocalizations that made my stomach clench. Most disturbing were the periods of absolute silence that followed these episodes, as if something was deliberately testing our reactions. Jake suggested we investigate one particularly active night in early September. Armed with flashlights and false bravado, we crept upstairs and peered through his kitchen window. The beam of my flashlight swept across the empty cul-de-sac, revealing nothing but cracked asphalt and scattered tumbleweeds. Yet the sensation of being watched pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. "There's nothing out there," Jake whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. We both saw how the shadows seemed to shift and writhe beyond our light's reach. Something about the darkness felt deliberately evasive, as if it possessed intelligence and malicious intent. The next morning, we examined the area in broad daylight, searching for evidence of nocturnal visitors. The ground showed no clear footprints or disturbances, though certain patches of dirt appeared oddly compressed. Jake found what looked like scratches in the asphalt near the cul-de-sac's center. but we couldn't determine if they were recent or had existed for years. Our investigation raised more questions than answers. If animals were responsible for the sounds, where were the tracks? If human activity was involved, why would anyone lurk in such a remote location? The absence of obvious explanations forced us to consider possibilities that challenged our understanding of the world around us. As September progressed, I noticed changes in my own behavior. I'd catch myself staring out windows, scanning the horizon for movement that never materialized. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams of pursuing something pale and skeletal across moonlit desert. During the day, ordinary shadows seemed to contain hidden threats, and I found myself avoiding areas where visibility was limited. October brought shorter days and longer nights, amplifying my growing anxiety about our isolated location. The temperature dropped enough to require jackets during evening activities, but cold weather didn't explain the bone-deep chill I experienced whenever I looked toward the empty cul-de-sac. Jake's family announced they'd be relocating to Salt Lake City before Christmas. His father had accepted a position at a larger hospital, offering better opportunities and higher pay. The news devastated me, not just because I'd lose my best friend, but because it meant facing whatever lurked in the darkness alone. We spent more time in his basement during those final weeks, partly to savor our remaining friendship, and partly because staying indoors felt safer. The strange sounds continued with increasing frequency, sometimes lasting for hours. On one particularly unnerving night, we heard what sounded like fingernails scraping against glass, though we couldn't locate the source. During a rare moment of courage, I suggested we try recording the sounds with Jake's phone. We positioned the device near the window well and waited in tense silence. When the familiar scraping began, followed by those wet, choking vocalizations, we captured nearly 10 minutes of audio. Listening to the playback the next morning proved more terrifying than experiencing it in real time. The recordings revealed details our frightened minds had missed. Beneath the obvious scraping sounds, we detected what resembled whispered words, though we couldn't decipher their meaning. Most disturbing was a rhythmic tapping that suggested intelligence and purpose. Whatever was producing these sounds wasn't acting on pure instinct. Jake's mother noticed our increasingly haggard appearances and asked if we were feeling ill. We couldn't explain how exhaustion and fear were draining our energy without sounding paranoid or delusional. Instead, we claimed stress about upcoming college applications and Jake's impending move. The lies came easily, but they couldn't mask the truth from ourselves. Something was fundamentally wrong with our situation, and we were running out of time to understand it. Jake would leave soon, abandoning me to face the growing darkness alone. The prospect filled me with dread that went beyond normal separation anxiety. Late one evening, as we sat pretending to focus on homework, Jake looked up from his textbook and asked the question that had been haunting us both. What if it's not an animal? November arrived with unseasonable warmth, but the pleasant weather couldn't dispel the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over our neighborhood. Jake's departure date was set for the weekend after Thanksgiving, giving us less than a month to solve the mystery that had been consuming our lives. We decided to conduct a more systematic investigation, documenting every strange occurrence with timestamps and detailed descriptions. Jake created a log on his laptop, recording not just the sounds but environmental factors like wind conditions, temperature, and moon phases. We hoped to identify patterns that might explain the phenomena. Our meticulous record-keeping revealed disturbing trends. The activities occurred most frequently during new moon periods when darkness was absolute. Wind direction seemed irrelevant, ruling out sounds carrying from distant sources. Most significantly, the episodes were becoming longer and more intense, suggesting whatever was responsible was growing bolder. One particularly active night, I made a decision that would haunt me for years. While Jake dozed fitfully on the couch, I crept upstairs and positioned myself at the kitchen window with binoculars. The sounds had been continuous for over an hour, accompanied by shadow movements that seemed to defy explanation. Through the binoculars, I observed something that challenged every rational explanation I'd considered. A figure moved across the cul-de-sac with jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Its proportions were wrong, too tall and thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. The figure appeared to be searching for something, methodically examining the ground and occasionally pausing to look directly toward Jake's house. When it turned in my direction, I caught a glimpse of a face that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the binoculars. The features were human but distorted, as if someone had stretched and warped them beyond recognition. Most terrifying was the thing's mouth, which hung open far wider than anatomy should allow. Dark fluid dripped from its lips, creating small puddles on the asphalt. The sight triggered a primal terror that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to my nervous system. I backed away from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally gathered courage to look again, the figure had vanished, leaving only empty pavement and my own ragged breathing. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the basement, too afraid to tell Jake what I'd witnessed. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real, and that knowledge changed everything. Thanksgiving week brought an unexpected development that shattered any remaining hopes of rational explanation. Jake's younger sister, Amy, mentioned seeing the sick man while walking their dog near the cul-de-sac. Her casual reference to something we'd been investigating in secret sent ice through my veins. When we questioned her about the encounter, Amy described a figure that matched my own terrifying observation. She'd noticed someone moving strangely near the broken pavement, apparently searching for something on the ground. What made her account particularly disturbing was her matter-of-fact tone, as if encountering such an entity was perfectly normal. "He looked really sick," she explained to her parents over dinner. "Like he needed to go to the hospital. His arms and legs were all wrong, and he kept making these weird sounds." Jake's parents exchanged concerned glances and promised to contact local authorities about a possible vagrant camping in the area. Their practical response highlighted how different adult and teenage perspectives could be. They saw a potential public health issue. We understood we were dealing with something that defied conventional categorization. The knowledge that others had witnessed the figure both validated our experiences and amplified our fear. If Amy could see it during daylight hours, the thing was becoming more active and less concerned about detection. The implications of this escalation filled me with mounting dread. Jake's anxiety about leaving increased dramatically after Amy's revelation. He confided that he felt guilty about abandoning me to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. We discussed involving our parents, but neither of us could articulate our fears without sounding mentally unstable. The final week before Jake's departure brought a frenzy of strange activity. Every night produced new sounds and disturbances that seemed deliberately designed to torment us. Sleep became impossible as we lay awake listening to scraping, tapping, and those wet, choking vocalizations that made our skin crawl. On Jake's last night, we made a decision that would define the rest of my teenage years. We would confront whatever was out there directly, hoping to gain some understanding of what we'd been experiencing. The plan was simple. Wait for the sounds to begin, then approach the cul-de-sac with flashlights and Jake's father's baseball bat. As midnight approached, we positioned ourselves near the back door, weapons in hand and hearts pounding with terror and determination. The familiar scraping sounds began right on schedule, accompanied by shadow movements that seemed to mock our fears. "Are you ready?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above my own ragged breathing. I nodded, knowing this moment would either provide answers or create new nightmares that would follow me forever. We stepped into the cold November air with every muscle tensed for fight or flight. The sounds emanating from the cul-de-sac had grown louder and more agitated, as if our presence had triggered some kind of response. Jake gripped his father's aluminum bat while I carried the largest flashlight we could find. The walk from his back door to the edge of the pavement felt like crossing an enormous distance. Each step brought new waves of terror that threatened to overwhelm my ability to move forward. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about the stupidity of our plan, but curiosity and desperate need for answers drove us onward. As we approached the broken asphalt, the sounds abruptly ceased, creating a silence so profound it seemed to ring in our ears. The absence of noise was somehow more frightening than the disturbances had been. It suggested intelligence and awareness that surpassed anything we'd previously considered. Jake raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the cul-de-sac's surface. The light revealed nothing but cracked pavement and scattered debris, yet the sensation of being watched pressed against us with suffocating intensity. Something was definitely present, lurking just beyond our ability to detect it. Then we heard breathing. Not the labored, choking sounds we'd grown accustomed to, but slow, deliberate respirations that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The breathing had a wet quality that suggested damaged lungs or airways, adding another layer of horror to our situation. "Where is it?" Jake whispered, his voice cracking with strain. Before I could respond, movement erupted from behind a cluster of sagebrush at the cul-de-sac's far edge. The figure I'd glimpsed through binoculars emerged into our flashlight beam, revealing details that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It had once been human, but disease or injury had transformed it into something barely recognizable. Its skin hung in loose folds, pale and translucent, stretched over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. The face was the worst part. Features melted and reformed by some terrible affliction that had left the mouth permanently agape and dripping. The thing's eyes reflected our flashlight beam like an animal's, but there was human intelligence behind them, a awareness that made its condition infinitely more tragic and terrifying. It regarded us with what might have been curiosity, tilting its head in a gesture that was almost childlike despite the horror of its appearance. Jake raised the baseball bat, but I grabbed his arm. Whatever this creature was, it had once been someone's family member, someone's child. The realization that we were looking at a human being in an advanced state of decay or disease changed everything about our situation. The figure made a sound that might have been an attempt at speech, though the words were unintelligible through its damaged vocal cords. Then it began moving toward us with that jerky, puppet-like gait I'd observed previously. We ran. The sprint back to Jake's house lasted only seconds, but the terror of those moments stretched them into eternity. We burst through the back door and immediately began securing every lock and window latch we could reach. The knowledge that something human yet monstrous was lurking outside transformed our sanctuary into a potential trap. Jake's parents were working late shifts, leaving us alone with our fear and the terrible understanding of what we'd encountered. We huddled in the basement, finally speaking the words we'd been afraid to voice. The figure was human, or had been human, before something horrific had transformed it. "We have to tell someone," Jake insisted, his hands still shaking from our confrontation. "That person needs medical help." But what could we tell authorities? That a diseased vagrant was camping near our neighborhood? How could we explain the inhuman movements, the distorted features, the sense of intelligence behind those reflective eyes? Any description we provided would sound like the ravings of teenagers with overactive imaginations. We spent hours debating our options while listening for sounds that might indicate the figure's continued presence. The silence outside was almost as disturbing as the previous nocturnal disturbances had been. At least the sounds had provided some indication of the thing's location and activities. Dawn brought Jake's departure and my first day alone with the knowledge of what existed beyond our neighborhood's boundaries. His family loaded their belongings into a moving truck while I stood in the driveway, fighting back tears that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with terror. "You'll be okay," Jake assured me during our final goodbye, but his eyes held the same fear that was consuming me. We both understood that my situation had become untenable, yet neither of us could think of viable solutions. After the truck disappeared down Juniper Street, I returned to my own house and tried to establish new routines that didn't involve Jake's basement sanctuary. But every room felt exposed. Every window seemed to offer insufficient protection against whatever might be watching from the darkness. My parents noticed my increasingly erratic behavior, but attributed it to depression over Jake's departure. They suggested counseling and increased social activities, unaware that my problems stemmed from knowledge of something that challenged the foundations of their reality. Sleep became impossible without pharmaceutical assistance. Even with prescription help, my dreams filled with images of pale, distorted figures dragging themselves across moonlit terrain. I'd wake in cold sweats, convinced that scraping sounds were coming from outside my bedroom window. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't share my burden with family or friends without risking my credibility and mental health reputation. The secret of what lurked in the darkness became a weight that threatened to crush my ability to function normally. Winter deepened, and the strange sounds returned with increasing frequency. Without Jake's presence to share the burden of fear, every nocturnal disturbance felt like a personal assault on my sanity. I developed elaborate rituals for securing my house each evening, checking locks multiple times, and positioning furniture to block potential entry points. My academic performance suffered as exhaustion and anxiety consumed my mental resources. Teachers expressed concern about my declining grades and frequent absences, but I couldn't explain how fear of something they'd never believe was destroying my ability to concentrate. During one particularly active period in late January, I made a discovery that provided both comfort and renewed terror. Research into rare medical conditions revealed several diseases that could theoretically produce the symptoms I'd observed in the figure. Advanced leprosy, severe autoimmune disorders, and certain genetic conditions could explain the physical distortions. The knowledge that medical science could account for the creature's appearance was enormously relieving. It meant I wasn't dealing with something supernatural or impossible, just tragically human. But this understanding also raised new questions about how such a person had ended up living rough in the Utah desert. I began leaving food and water near the cul-de-sac, reasoning that if the figure was indeed a sick human being, basic compassion demanded some attempt to help. The offerings disappeared regularly, though I never witnessed their collection. Somehow this small act of kindness made the entire situation more bearable. Spring arrived early that year, bringing warmth and longer days that gradually reduced the frequency of nocturnal disturbances. I began to hope that the figure had moved on, seeking shelter or medical care elsewhere. The sounds that had terrorized me for months became memory, then gradually faded to the back of my consciousness. Graduation approached with promises of college and escape from the isolation that had defined my final year of high school. I accepted admission to a university 3 states away, partly for academic reasons, but mostly to put distance between myself and the memories that haunted Juniper Street. On my last night before leaving for college, I walked to the cul-de-sac one final time. The broken pavement remained unchanged, but the oppressive atmosphere that had once characterized this place seemed diminished. Perhaps the figure had indeed found help, or perhaps death had finally claimed whatever disease had been consuming it. I never saw the pale, distorted figure again, but the experience of those months changed my understanding of the world's hidden corners. Somewhere beyond the boundaries of normal life, suffering exists that challenges our capacity for comprehension and compassion. Years later, whenever I encounter news stories about missing persons or unidentified remains found in remote locations, I remember the creature that lurked near my childhood home. I wonder about the circumstances that led a human being to such desperate isolation, and I hope that whatever happened to that poor soul, it finally found the peace that had been stolen by disease and abandonment. The memory serves as a reminder that horror often wears a human face, and that the monsters we fear most are usually the ones we create through neglect, cruelty, and our failure to care for the most vulnerable among us. I was 19 when this happened, back in June of 2003, and even now, 20 years later, I can't shake the memory. Growing up in Wells, Nevada, there wasn't much to do except explore the endless miles of desert and mountains that stretched in every direction. My friends thought I was crazy for spending my weekends alone in those desolate places. But there was something about abandoned settlements and forgotten mining claims that called to me like a siren song. The burger joint in Wells had these old maps from the early 1900s preserved under glass on every table. I'd spent countless hours studying them while nursing a coffee, tracing my finger along roads that no longer existed, noting the locations of towns that had been swallowed by time. One map in particular caught my attention. It showed several settlements just north of Ruby Valley in Elko County, places with names like Prospect Creek and Silver Ridge that weren't on any modern map. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, gathering supplies and checking my gear. My 1972 Dodge W200 pickup was perfect for these expeditions, built like a tank and high enough to clear most obstacles. The truck was army green with rust creeping along the wheel wells, but the engine was solid and the four-wheel drive had never let me down. I'd inherited it from my grandfather, along with his love for the remote places where civilization had tried and failed to take hold. Being raised in a family of hunters and ranchers, I never went anywhere without protection. Wild animals were common in the Ruby Mountains. Mountain lions, bears, and the occasional pack of feral dogs that had gone wild after being abandoned by prospectors decades earlier. My rifle was an HK-91, a semi-automatic .308 that my uncle had brought back from his time in the military. The weight of it was reassuring in my hands, and I could hit a target at 300 yards without breaking a sweat. The morning I set out was clear and calm, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains look close enough to touch. I filled the truck with gas, loaded my rifle with a 20-round magazine, and stuffed 2 spare magazines into my backpack along with water, jerky, and a first aid kit. My father asked where I was headed as I loaded my gear, and I told him I was exploring north of Ruby Valley. He paused in his coffee drinking and gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "Be careful up there," he said, which struck me as odd. My father wasn't the type to worry unnecessarily, but something in his voice made me take notice. Some places are forgotten for good reason. I laughed it off at the time, but his words would echo in my mind later. The drive from Wells to the Ruby Valley area took about 2 hours on Highway 93, passing through landscape that seemed untouched by time. The road stretched straight as an arrow across valleys dotted with sagebrush and Joshua trees, with mountains rising like purple walls on either side. Traffic was almost non-existent, maybe one car every 20 minutes. When I reached the turnoff that would take me into the valley proper, I stopped to check my map one more time. The modern road would take me only so far. After that, I'd be following mining roads and cattle paths that might not even exist anymore. The nearest town was more than 50 miles away, and cell phone coverage was non-existent in the mountains. If something went wrong, I'd be on my own. The paved road ended after about 10 miles, replaced by a dirt track that wound through stands of pinyon pine and juniper. The truck's suspension groaned as I navigated ruts and rocks, but I kept a steady pace, windows down to enjoy the mountain air. The temperature dropped noticeably as I gained elevation, and the silence was broken only by the rumble of my engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. I passed several old homesteads in various states of decay, collapsed barns, rusted fence posts, and the scattered remains of what had once been someone's dream of making a life in this harsh country. Each one told a story of hope and eventual defeat, of families who had packed up and left when the mines played out, or the winters became too brutal to endure. About 3 hours into the drive, I found what I was looking for. A barely visible track heading north into a canyon that didn't appear on any modern map. The entrance was marked only by a weathered wooden sign so faded I couldn't make out what it had once said. Ancient tire tracks were still visible in the hardpan, suggesting that someone had been this way before, though probably not recently. The path climbed steadily through dense stands of pine and aspen, their branches sometimes scraping against the sides of my truck. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. I'd expected to hear birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but there was nothing except the labored breathing of my engine as it worked to maintain traction on the increasingly steep grade. After another hour of slow progress, I encountered my first real obstacle, a massive pinyon pine that had fallen across the road. The tree was easily 2 feet in diameter and had been down for years, judging by the way smaller trees and brush had grown up around it. There was no way to drive around it. The canyon walls were too steep and the undergrowth too thick. I parked the truck and walked around the fallen giant, trying to estimate how much work it would take to clear a path. The tree had fallen naturally. I could see the rotted stump where it had broken off, probably during a severe winter storm. But what struck me as odd was the complete absence of saw marks or any attempt to clear the road. If anyone had been using this route regularly, they would have dealt with this obstacle years ago. Standing there in the shadow of that fallen tree, I felt the first stirring of unease. The silence was absolute now, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted, just to break the oppressive quiet, and my voice echoed off the canyon walls before being swallowed by the trees. No response came back. No bird calls. No rustle of disturbed wildlife. Nothing. I decided to continue on foot, grabbing my rifle and extra ammunition before locking the truck. The fallen tree was easy enough to climb over, and on the other side, the road continued its relentless climb toward what the old map had marked as Prospect Creek. I estimated I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, enough time to reach the settlement and explore before making the trek back to my truck. The road beyond the tree was in better condition than I'd expected, though still obviously abandoned. Someone had maintained it once, probably during the mining boom of the early 1900s, but nature was slowly reclaiming it. Wildflowers grew in the center strip, and saplings had taken root in cracks in the hardpan. Still, it was clearly defined and easy to follow as it wound deeper into the mountains. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes when I noticed the change in the forest around me. Below the fallen tree, the woods had been normal, thick with undergrowth, fallen logs, and the usual debris of a living ecosystem. But here, everything was different. The trees grew in unnaturally straight lines, as if they'd been planted rather than seeded naturally. The undergrowth was sparse, and what plants did grow seemed stunted and pale. More disturbing was the continued absence of sound. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that even the quietest forest had background noise. The whisper of wind through leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the scurry of chipmunks through the brush. But here, the silence was so complete, it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. After another 20 minutes of hiking, the road began to level out and curve to the right. Through the trees ahead, I could see a clearing and what looked like the remains of buildings. My pulse quickened with anticipation. This was what I'd come for, a piece of history that had been abandoned and forgotten, waiting for someone to rediscover it. But as I approached the edge of the clearing, that feeling of wrongness intensified. Something about this place didn't feel right. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on me like the moment before a thunderstorm. I stopped at the tree line and studied the scene before me, trying to identify what was triggering my unease. The settlement consisted of a main cabin and several smaller outbuildings, all in remarkably good condition for structures that had been abandoned for nearly a century. The cabin was a substantial log building with a stone chimney and what appeared to be a covered porch. The windows were intact, which was unusual. Most abandoned buildings I'd explored had long since had their glass broken by weather or vandals. I approached the cabin slowly, my rifle held ready, but not quite raised. The building was larger than it had appeared from the tree line, probably 200 square feet, with a high-pitched roof designed to shed snow. The logs were still solid, chinked with what looked like original mortar that had held up remarkably well. A wooden porch wrapped around the front and one side with hand-carved railings that showed the skill of whoever had built this place. What really caught my attention were the windows, Not only was the glass intact, but there were curtains hanging behind them. Faded and moth-eaten, but definitely there. In my experience, anything made of fabric disappeared quickly in abandoned buildings, eaten by insects and small animals, or simply rotted away by moisture and time. Yet here were curtains that looked like they'd been hanging undisturbed for decades. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch, wincing as they creaked under my weight. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The front door was made of heavy wood with wrought iron hinges and a large brass handle that had tarnished to green. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door swung open with a groan of protest from hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. The interior of the cabin took my breath away, but not in a good way. Most abandoned buildings I'd explored were empty shells, stripped of anything valuable and left to decay. This cabin was fully furnished, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a walk and planned to return for dinner. A substantial wooden table dominated the center of the main room, surrounded by 4 chairs with woven seats. Place settings for 4 people were arranged on the table: plates, glasses, silverware, even folded napkins. In one corner stood a wood-burning stove with a pile of split logs beside it. Pots and pans hung from hooks on the wall, and shelves held an assortment of dishes and cooking implements. Everything was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, but it was all there, as if waiting for someone to return and resume their life. The bedroom was equally disturbing. A large brass bed dominated the space, still made up with quilts and pillows that had somehow survived the decades. A dresser held personal items, a hairbrush with strands of gray hair still caught in the bristles, bottles of medicine with labels too faded to read, and a small leather-bound book that crumbled when I tried to open it. On the walls hung photographs in wooden frames, their subjects long faded to ghostly outlines. I could make out the shapes of people, a family, I thought, but their faces were indistinct shadows. One photograph seemed better preserved than the others, showing 4 figures standing in front of this very cabin. 2 adults and 2 children, I thought, though the details were unclear. What really unnerved me was the sense that someone had left in a hurry. Drawers were pulled out, as if someone had been packing quickly. Personal items were scattered on the floor. In the kitchen, I found moldy remains of what might have been a meal, long since consumed by insects and time. Whatever had driven these people away, it had happened suddenly. I spent perhaps 20 minutes in the cabin, my unease growing with each passing moment. The place felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It wasn't just the preserved state of everything, it was something deeper, a sense that I was trespassing in a place where something terrible had happened. The air inside felt thick and hard to breathe, carrying an underlying odor of mustiness and something else I couldn't identify. When I finally stepped back onto the porch, I was grateful for the fresh mountain air, despite its unnatural stillness. I decided to check the rifle chamber, and the metallic click of the bolt echoed across the clearing like a gunshot. The sound was reassuring, a reminder that I wasn't completely helpless in this place that seemed to exist outside normal experience. Behind the cabin, I noticed a stone-lined well with a wooden cover that had partially collapsed. As I approached it, I became aware of a new sound, a faint rustling that seemed to come from below ground. At first, I thought it might be wind moving through an underground passage, but the air above ground was completely still. When I was about 30 feet from the well, the smell hit me. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, sweet, cloying, and so intense it made my eyes water. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, but the odor seemed to penetrate everything. Something had died down there, and from the strength of the smell, it had been something large. I forced myself to move closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The rustling sound grew louder as I approached, and I realized it wasn't wind at all. Something was moving down in the darkness of that well, and whatever it was very much alive. I could hear scratching sounds like claws on stone, and what might have been breathing, low, labored, and definitely not human. The wooden cover of the well had rotted and partially collapsed, leaving a gap large enough for someone to fall through. I found a small stone and dropped it into the opening, counting the seconds until I heard it hit bottom. The well was deep, at least 40 feet, and from the echoing quality of the impact, it opened into some kind of underground chamber. The smell was becoming unbearable, and the sounds from below were growing more agitated. I backed away from the well, my rifle now raised and ready. Whatever was down there had noticed my presence, and I had no desire to find out what it was. The logical part of my mind suggested it might be an injured animal that had fallen in and couldn't climb out, but some deeper instinct warned me that this was something far more dangerous. I decided to check the mine shaft I'd spotted earlier, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the people who once lived here. The entrance was built into the hillside about 100 yards behind the cabin, with heavy timber supports framing the opening. Unlike the random holes I'd explored in other locations, this was clearly a professional operation, with rails for ore cars still visible disappearing into the darkness. As I climbed toward the entrance, I noticed an unusual warm breeze flowing from the shaft. Most mines maintained a constant cool temperature, acting like natural refrigerators even in summer. But this air was warm and carried with it an even stronger version of the putrid smell I'd encountered at the well. The stench was so intense I had to stop several times to keep from gagging. The mine entrance was larger than I'd expected, probably 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, supported by massive timbers that showed signs of recent maintenance. That should have been my first warning. If this mine had been abandoned for decades, those timbers should have been rotted and collapsed. Instead, they looked solid and well-maintained, as if someone had been taking care of them. I pulled out my flashlight and pointed it into the tunnel. The beam illuminated perhaps 30 feet of the passage before being swallowed by darkness. The rails continued straight into the mountain, and I could see side passages branching off the main tunnel. What I couldn't see was any sign of the cave-in or flooding that usually made these old mines impassable. That warm breeze continued to flow from the depths, carrying with it not just the smell of decay but other odors. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else that reminded me of a zoo or animal pen. I stood at the entrance for several minutes, fighting the urge to turn and run while trying to work up the courage to explore further. The sound came without warning, a low moan that echoed from somewhere deep in the mine shaft. It was definitely human in origin, but distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. The moan was followed by other sounds, scratching, scraping, and what might have been whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. I took one step into the mine entrance, my flashlight beam probing the darkness ahead. The warm air felt unnatural against my face, and the smell was so strong I could taste it. Another moan echoed from the depths, closer this time, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, multiple sets moving toward the entrance. My rational mind tried to provide explanations. Maybe there were homeless people living in the mine, taking shelter in a place where they wouldn't be disturbed. Maybe what I was hearing was just someone in distress who needed help. But every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this place as quickly as possible. I was backing away from the mine entrance when I saw the first shadow moving in the depths. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. A human figure, but wrong in ways that made my mind refuse to process what I was seeing. It was crouched low, moving on all fours like an animal, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. The figure moved with a fluid grace that was somehow more terrifying than if it had shambled like a movie monster. This thing was fast, agile, and clearly intelligent enough to stay partially hidden in the shadows. As it drew closer to the entrance, I could make out more details that sent ice through my veins. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched tight over a skeletal frame that looked like it belonged to someone who had been starving for months. But this wasn't simple malnutrition. This was something that had adapted to living in darkness, feeding on things that shouldn't be food. Its fingers were elongated and ended in what looked like claws or heavily overgrown fingernails. When it lifted its head, I caught a glimpse of its face in my flashlight beam. The features were human, but distorted, as if someone had taken a normal person and stretched them like taffy. The eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and when it opened its mouth, I saw teeth that had been filed or worn into points. That's when it screamed. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part human shriek, part animal howl, with an underlying note that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was the sound of madness given voice, of pain and hunger and rage all rolled into one horrific cry. My ears rang from the assault, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it. Training took over before conscious thought. I raised my rifle and put the front sight on what I hoped was center mass. The rifle bucked against my shoulder 5 times in rapid succession, the muzzle flash illuminating the mine entrance in strobing white light. I heard the distinctive sound of bullets hitting flesh, and the creature's scream changed pitch, becoming even more agonized. But that's when I realized this thing wasn't alone. The answering screams came from multiple directions, from deeper in the mine, from the area around the well, and from the hillsides above me. Whatever these things were, there were several of them, and they were coordinating their response to my presence. I heard the sound of rocks falling as something large moved through the trees above the mine entrance. I started running back toward the cabin, ejecting the empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one as I moved. Behind me, I could hear multiple sets of feet or claws hitting the ground as things emerged from the mine shaft. They were following me, and from the sounds they were making, they were angry. I made it about halfway to the cabin before I realized I was surrounded. These things, whatever they were, had spread out to cut off my escape routes. I could see movement in the trees on both sides of the clearing, shapes that moved too quickly and too fluidly to be normal humans. They stayed in the shadows, but I caught glimpses of pale skin and elongated limbs as they moved from tree to tree. The one I'd shot was still screaming somewhere behind me, but its cries were getting fainter. Either it was dying, or it was moving away to nurse its wounds, but the others were very much active, and they were closing in. I could hear them communicating with each other. Not words exactly, but a series of clicks and guttural sounds that might have been some kind of language. I reached the cabin and took shelter behind the porch, using the structure as cover while I tried to spot targets. The rifle felt solid in my hands, but I only had about 15 rounds left, and I had no idea how many of these things I was facing. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and the oppressive silence that had marked this place was now broken by sounds of movement all around me. One of them broke cover, sprinting across the clearing in a hunched-over run that covered ground with frightening speed. I led the target and squeezed the trigger, hearing the bullet connect with a wet thunk. The creature stumbled and fell, but was back on its feet almost immediately, leaving a dark trail on the ground as it disappeared back into the trees. They were learning from my attacks, staying hidden and trying to get close enough to overwhelm me. I could hear them moving through the brush, circling the cabin like wolves. Every few seconds, one would show itself just long enough to draw my fire, then disappear before I could get a clean shot. I was down to my last magazine when I decided I had to make a break for the truck. Staying here was suicide. They would eventually work up the courage to rush me all at once, and there was no way I could fight them all off. My only chance was to reach the vehicle and get out of this nightmare place. I sprinted for the tree line, firing at anything that moved. Behind me, I heard the creatures give chase, their inhuman screams echoing off the canyon walls. They were fast, but they seemed reluctant to leave the cover of the trees. Every time one got close to the open road, it would duck back into the shadows. The fallen tree seemed like it was miles away, though I knew it was only a few hundred yards. I could hear them pacing me on both sides, staying hidden but matching my speed. When I finally reached the barrier, I threw myself over it with more desperation than grace, landing hard on the other side and scrambling for my truck. The engine turned over on the first try, and I threw the transmission into reverse without even closing the door properly. As I spun the truck around, my headlights swept across the forest, and I got my clearest look yet at one of my pursuers. It was crouched on a fallen log about 50 feet away, its pale skin almost glowing in the headlight beam. This one was larger than the others I'd seen, with broader shoulders and longer arms. It was definitely human in basic structure, but it had been changed by whatever circumstances had driven it to live in this forgotten place. Its face was gaunt and feral, with hollow cheeks and eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. For just a moment, we stared at each other through the windshield. Then it opened its mouth and spoke, or tried to. The sounds that came out were almost words, garbled and slurred as if it had forgotten how human speech worked. But there was intelligence there, a mind that was still trying to communicate even though it had been driven far beyond the boundaries of sanity. I gunned the engine and fled down the mountain road, not slowing down until I reached the highway. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see pale figures emerging from the darkness behind me. It wasn't until I was back in Wells, sitting in the familiar parking lot of the burger joint, that I finally felt safe enough to turn off the engine. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that day. How could I? Who would believe that somewhere in the Ruby Mountains, there were people who had been living like animals for decades, feeding on God knows what, and slowly losing their humanity in the process? I tried to convince myself that they were just homeless people, maybe mentally ill individuals who had taken shelter in the mine and been driven mad by isolation and starvation. But I knew better. What I'd seen wasn't just mental illness or malnutrition. Those things had been changed by their circumstances, adapted to a life that no human being should have to live. They'd found ways to survive in a place where survival should have been impossible, and in the process, they'd given up everything that made them human. When I got home that night, my father took one look at my face and knew something had happened. I told him I'd gotten lost and had to spend longer than expected getting back to the truck, but he wasn't buying it. Finally, he asked me directly if I'd found the cabin with the fallen tree across the road. When I nodded, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about the plane crashes, military aircraft that had gone down in the mountains during the 1940s and 50s, and the recovery teams that had been sent to retrieve the bodies. Most of the crashes had been successfully handled, but there had been one incident where the recovery team never made it back. Sometimes, he said, choosing his words carefully, people survive things they shouldn't survive. And sometimes what they become isn't something you'd want to meet in a dark place. He never elaborated, and I never asked for more details, but I understood what he was telling me. Those things in the mine weren't monsters. They were human beings who had been pushed beyond the breaking point and found ways to keep going that should have been impossible. 20 years later, I still think about that place. Part of me wants to organize an expedition, bring cameras and proper equipment, maybe even contact authorities about what might be living up there. But a larger part of me knows that some secrets are better left buried. Whatever happened to turn those people into the things I encountered, it's a kind of hell that no one should have to witness. I've never been back to Ruby Valley, and I never will. Some places are forgotten for good reason, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The world has enough darkness without shining a light into corners where humanity has been stripped away and replaced with something that should not exist. But on quiet nights, when the wind is still and the world seems to hold its breath, I sometimes hear echoes of those screams, and I remember pale faces in the darkness, reaching out from a place where civilization failed and something else took its place. Something that might once have been human, but had forgotten what that word meant. That's my story. I've never shared the complete version before, and I probably never will again. But sometimes, the weight of carrying it alone becomes too much, and you have to tell someone, even if they don't believe you. Because the alternative, pretending it never happened, Feels like a betrayal of the truth, no matter how horrible that truth might be. I never intended to become a park ranger. Growing up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, I was more interested in video games and comic books than the great outdoors. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns. After high school, I bounced around between dead-end jobs, trying to make ends meet while pursuing my dream of becoming a graphic novelist. But the dream remained frustratingly out of reach. I was chronically broke, barely scraping by, and starting to lose hope. That's when I saw the job listing. Park ranger positions available in several states, including Pennsylvania. No experience necessary, on-the-job training provided. To be honest, I applied on a whim without giving it much thought. I never expected to get an interview, let alone an offer. But life is full of surprises. A month later, I found myself driving deep into the Allegheny National Forest of northwestern Pennsylvania, on my way to the remote ranger outpost that would be my home for the next 6 months. I tried to stay positive, reminding myself that at least the job provided free room and board. If nothing else, it would give me a chance to save some money while figuring out my next move. Still, as the miles ticked by and civilization receded in the rearview mirror, an uneasy feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sense that I was driving headlong into the unknown, into a world I wasn't fully prepared for. As the road twisted and turned through the shadowy forest, the October afternoon rapidly darkened toward dusk. According to the crude map I'd been given, the ranger station should be just ahead, but there was still no sign of it. Suddenly my headlights flashed across a weathered wooden sign, "Ranger Station 1 mile," and an arrow pointing up a narrow dirt track. I turned up the bumpy lane, fallen leaves swirling in my wake. The forest pressed close on either side, the spindly branches scratching at my windows like skeletal fingers. At last I rounded a bend, and my headlights settled on a small log cabin nestled in a clearing. A battered pickup truck was parked out front. I pulled up next to it and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the forest seemed to exhale a held breath, a long, deep sigh that sounded almost relieved. Or maybe it was just my imagination. I'd always been prone to flights of fancy, especially when I was nervous. And I was very, very nervous. Grabbing my duffel bag, I headed for the cabin door. It opened before I could knock. A grizzled older man stood inside, his flannel shirt and full beard marking him as a classic outdoorsman. He sized me up with shrewd gray eyes. "You must be the new recruit," he said gruffly. "I'm John, the supervising ranger. Come on in and we'll get you situated." I followed him inside, the plank floor creaking under my feet. The cabin was Spartan but functional, with a small kitchen, a living area centered around a cast iron stove, and a hallway leading to what I assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. Antlers, faded maps, and old photographs adorned the walls. It had a certain rustic charm, but it was a far cry from the creature comforts I was used to. John showed me to my room, which held a simple cot, a wooden chest for my belongings, and a tiny writing desk overlooking the forest. Then he ran me through the daily routine, manning the ranger station, patrolling the trails, assisting visitors, and performing various maintenance tasks around the park. It was a lot to take in, especially for a greenhorn like me. But John assured me he'd teach me everything I needed to know. As we shared a meager dinner of canned stew that night, John told me stories of his decades working these woods. Most were the usual tales of black bear encounters, lost hikers, and the occasional drunken camper. But there was one story he only hinted at, his voice dropping low as if he were afraid of being overheard. "There's strange things in these woods," he murmured, staring into the flickering coals of the stove. "Things that don't rightly belong. You'll hear the old-timers talk about them sometimes, when the night is dark and the wind is high. They say..." He trailed off and shook his head, as if thinking better of whatever he'd been about to say. An involuntary shiver worked its way down my spine. I wanted to ask him to continue, but something held me back. An animal instinct, warning me that there were some mysteries better left unexplored. John retired to bed soon after, leaving me alone with the popping of the stove and the mournful sighing of the wind in the eaves. I stayed up a while longer, writing in my journal and trying to give form to the tangled thoughts and emotions of the day. But exhaustion soon overtook me. I banked the fire, turned in, and fell into a dreamless sleep. Little did I know that miles away, deeper in the trackless forest, something ancient was stirring in the darkness. Something that had slumbered for ages uncounted, but would slumber no more. And it was slowly, inexorably, making its way towards the unsuspecting inhabitants of the peaceful little cabin. I awoke the next morning to sunlight slanting through the bedroom window and the rich aroma of campfire coffee brewing. For a fleeting moment, I thought I was a kid again, waking up at summer camp. But reality came rushing back soon enough. After a quick breakfast with John, we headed out to the ranger station, a larger log structure a short hike from the cabin. The air was cool and clear, and mist hung in gauzy veils between the towering pines. In the light of day, my fears from the previous night seemed silly, like childish fears of the boogeyman under the bed. What could possibly threaten me in such a tranquil place? The morning passed uneventfully as John showed me the ins and outs of station duties. There were trail maps to update, weather reports to file, park brochures to stock. He demonstrated how to use the radios to communicate with the other far-flung ranger stations. By lunchtime, my head was swimming with new information. But John seemed pleased with my progress. "You're doing well, kid," he said as we ate our sandwiches on the porch, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. "Takes most greenies a week to remember half of what I've thrown at you." I felt a flush of pride at the compliment. Maybe this job wouldn't be so tough after all. Maybe I'd even come to enjoy the peace and solitude, a welcome change of pace from the chaotic scramble of my life before. After lunch came my first solo task, hiking one of the trails to clear any fallen branches or other debris. Armed with a pack of supplies and one of the handheld radios, I set off down the Deer Creek Trail, named for the gurgling stream that paralleled its path. At first I enjoyed the hike, breathing in the sweet scents of black earth and pine pitch, marveling at the play of golden sunbeams through the canopy. I felt like I'd wandered into a Hudson River School painting. With just a few snips of my lopping shears here and there, the trail was clear and I made good time. But as the afternoon wore on and the sun sank lower, I began to feel uneasy. The friendly greens and golds of the forest took on more somber shades of blue and gray. Shadows gathered in the thickets and hollows. And was it my imagination, or were the bird songs fewer and more tentative? I was just thinking of turning back when I glimpsed something through the trees that made me pause. A flash of white against the brown and green. Curious, I stepped off the trail for a closer look. There, caught on a twisted root at the base of a massive oak tree, was what appeared to be a scrap of cloth or paper. I leaned down and gingerly plucked it free. It was a page, yellowed and brittle with age, torn on one edge as if ripped from a book. The paper was covered in a dense, spiky scrawl, written in an alphabet I'd never seen before. The characters seemed to writhe and crawl before my eyes, defying comprehension. But at the bottom of the page was a drawing, faded but still clear, that turned my blood to ice. It depicted a figure, gaunt and elongated, with antlers springing from its head and hooves where its feet should be. Malevolent eyes glared from its sunken face. Dancing imp-like around its cloven feet were twisted little homunculi, all grinning skulls and grasping claws. Unnerved, I stuffed the unsettling page in my pocket, hurried back to the trail, and made for the station at the best pace I could manage without actually running. What did it mean? Some hiker's idea of a prank, or something darker? Try as I might, I couldn't dislodge the image from my mind's eye. It gibbered at me from the periphery of my thoughts, capering at the threshold between reason and nightmare. Back at the station, I debated telling John about my strange find, but something held me back. I didn't want him to think I was some gullible rube, spooked by what was probably just a bit of trash left by an oddball hiker. Park rangers were supposed to be made of sterner stuff. So I kept quiet, stashing the freakish page in the chest at the foot of my cot and doing my best to put it out of my mind. But that night, as the wind moaned through the chinks in the cabin walls and the branch shadows clawed at my window, it crept into my dreams. I found myself back on the Deer Creek Trail, but the forest had turned twisted and wrong, the trees looming like skeletal sentinels, their bark etched with unreadable glyphs. The gurgling stream now ran black as pitch and smelled of sulfur. Up ahead, a figure stumbled down the path, dragging one leg behind it at a grotesque angle. At first, I thought it was another hiker in need of help. But as I hurried closer, I saw that the thing had antlers growing from its head, and its hands ended in jagged claws. It spun to face me, and I recoiled in horror. Its visage was a bare skull, with malevolent sparks glowing in its hollow eye sockets. It let out a ululating screech that turned my knees to water. Then, to my mounting terror, it began to lurch towards me, moving far faster than any human could. I woke with a strangled cry, heart pounding, the reek of the thing still thick in my nostrils. Just a dream, I told myself as I waited for my racing pulse to slow. Just my overactive imagination, nothing more. The unfamiliar surroundings and John's spooky campfire tales had simply gotten under my skin. At least that's what I tried to believe. But I couldn't shake the deep primal dread that had sunk its claws into my guts. Something told me that there was more to my dream and to the mysterious page than I wanted to contemplate. Somewhere in these deep, dark woods, an ancient evil was awakening, and I had blundered into its path. The next day passed without incident, and I began to relax a bit. The nightmares didn't return, and the humdrum routine of ranger duties acted as a balm to my jangled nerves. There were trails to walk, maps to file, supply inventories to take. The crisp autumn air and honest work was like a tonic. Maybe, I allowed myself to hope, this job would be the fresh start I needed after all. A chance to clear my head, refill the coffers, and figure out my next steps in life. Surrounded by the serene majesty of the forest, my previous worries and failures seemed to recede, like mist beneath the morning sun. But on my fourth day, that fragile peace was shattered. Mid-morning, a call came in over the radio from a ranger station 20 miles north. A group of hikers had stumbled into the station in hysterics, babbling about one of their party being attacked on the trail. The rangers were mounting a search and rescue mission, and they needed all available hands. John and I threw our gear together and piled into the pickup. As we bounced along the dirt roads, he filled me in on the situation. The group had been hiking a remote trail along Mosquito Creek when they had heard screams from their friend Michelle, who had lagged behind the group. They had rushed back to find her sprawled on the trail, dazed and badly scratched, her clothes shredded. Of her attacker, there had been no sign. An icy knot formed in my gut as I listened, the dream surging back up from the depths of memory. Whatever had assailed Michelle, I knew with grim certainty that it was no ordinary woodland creature. The evil I had sensed, the antlered thing from the torn page, had made its first move, and it wouldn't be the last. We reached the turnoff for Mosquito Creek and followed the winding track up into the hills, the tires skidding on the gravel and the suspension groaning. Ahead, I could see the other rangers' vehicles parked in a clearing. We pulled up and leapt out to join the search party. But as we combed the woods, calling Michelle's name until our throats were raw, a sickening realization crept over me. We weren't hunting for the lost hiker. Not anymore. We were prey. The unseen thing that lurked in the forest, the nightmare made flesh, was hunting us. I could feel its unseen eyes on me, could all but hear its hungry breath rasping in the shadow-choked thickets. It was toying with us, I realized, savoring our fear, glutting on our dread. This was just the beginning of its twisted game. And I, the Greenhorn Ranger with a head full of scary stories, was to be its special pawn. We searched until the light began to fail, but found no trace of Michelle. Defeated, our nerves frayed, we trudged back to the vehicles. John radioed the other stations, giving them the grim news. A pall of morose silence fell over the group. As we drove back to our cabin in the dying light, I finally screwed up my courage to tell John about the disturbing page I had found and the nightmares that had followed. But to my surprise, he didn't scoff or make light. Instead, his weathered face grew grimmer than I had ever seen it. "I warned you there were strange things in these woods," he said quietly. "Things that don't belong. Looks like you've gone and stirred one of them up." He fell silent for a long moment, jaw working as if chewing over some difficult decision. Finally, he spoke again. "There's old stories around these parts," he said slowly. "Stories the Rangers don't much talk about. About creatures that walk like men but ain't men. Things that come creeping out of the deep hollows and dark places when the stars are right." A chill slithered up my spine as I listened. Gone was John's usual gruff pragmatism. In its place was something I'd never expected to hear in his voice. Fear. "They say there was a cult, way back when," he continued. "Bunch of crazy folk who worshipped these things. Made sacrifices to them. Till the Rangers put a stop to it." He paused, his eyes distant. "Or thought they did anyway. But maybe some of those old monstrosities didn't go quiet into that dark night after all. Maybe some of them are still out there, waiting, sleeping, but damn well not dead." I sat stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. Part of me still wanted to dismiss it as superstitious nonsense, the ravings of bored and isolated woodsmen. But in my bones, I knew John was telling the truth. The impossible, awful truth. That night I lay sleepless in my bunk, watching the waning moon paint twisted shadows on the wall and listening to the wind keen a mournful descant in the eaves. What have I gotten myself into? I wondered in slack-jawed wonder and mounting despair. I wasn't a hero or a savior. I was a scared kid way out of my depth, caught up in something I had no hope of understanding, let alone fighting. But like it or not, I was here now. And one way or another, I knew I'd see this eerie business through to its bitter end. The next morning dawned chill and lowering, the sky gravid with the promise of rain. John was quiet and withdrawn, his eyes glazed and haunted, and I didn't have the heart to press him for more dark revelations. We went through the motions of the daily chores, but the air between us was fraught with unspoken fears. Every snapping twig, every skirling bird call sent me flinching and looking over my shoulder for antlered horrors. The once comforting forest suddenly felt claustrophobic, sinister, like it was full of watching eyes and grasping claws. It all came to a head that afternoon. Clouds were piling up in the east, and unseasonable chill was gathering. John and I had just finished our forlorn lunch when the radio crackled to life. "John, come in. Over." The signal was weak and staticky, the voice on the other end strained. John snatched up the handset. "This is John. Go ahead." "John. Found something. Mosquito Creek." The transmission dissolved into a burst of white noise. "Ritual site. Those symbols. Need backup." A grim look settled over John's grizzled features. He depressed the talk button. "Sit tight. We're on our way. Over." Turning to me, he said, "Grab your gear, kid. I got a bad feeling about this." Minutes later, we were bouncing up the old logging road, the ancient pickup's suspension protesting every rut and pothole. The sky had turned a bruised purple, gravid with unfallen rain. The air smelled heavy and foul, thick with the sickly sweet scent of rot. We found the other rangers huddled at the trailhead. They looked ashen and spooked, darting wary glances at the tree line. Deputy Hank, usual a stolid bull of a man, was practically quivering. "John, thank God," he said as we pulled up. "We found... well, hell, you'd better come see for yourself." He led us down an overgrown spur of the trail. The forest had gone preternaturally silent. No bird calls, no skittering squirrels. Only the crunch of dead leaves beneath our boots. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. After a quarter mile, Hank held up a hand, signaling a halt. "There," he whispered, pointing. Ahead, half hidden in a blackberry thicket, were the crumbling remains of what looked to have once been a small cabin or shed. Its roof had caved in and its walls were scabrous with moss and lichen. But it wasn't the building itself that sucked the air from my lungs and set my blood to icy sludge. No, it was the symbols carved into the weathered wood, knife-cut and crudely pigmented. The same squirming, non-Euclidean hieroglyphs that had adorned the page I had found. They crawled across every surface, an insane scrawl of eldritch sigils and mad geometries. And there, in the center of the room, half obscured by the collapsed ceiling beams, was a sight I knew would haunt me till my dying day. A crude altar of piled stones, their surface stained a rusty brown. Scattered around it were yellowing shards of bone. Whether animal or human, I tried very hard not to speculate. "Mother of God," John breathed. His face had gone the color of spoiled milk. "The old stories, they're true." I opened my mouth, though to say what I had no clue. A warning, a denial, a prayer, they all clustered unspoken in my throat. But I never got the chance to give them voice. Because at that moment, from somewhere deep in the tangled black heart of the forest, there came a sound that turned my innards to ice. An ululating cry, the bastard offspring of a wolf's howl and a madman's shriek, filled with a malice and hunger that could not possibly be of this world. And beneath that eldritch vocalization, I could all but feel the attention of some immense and unspeakable presence turn suddenly, inexorably, towards us. We had trespassed on its domain, disturbed its charnel house, and now, like any predator, it would deal with the interlopers. Swiftly, brutally, and with a fury unmatched by anything spawned of nature's kinder environs. In that instant, I knew we had only two choices: stand our ground and face the oncoming horror, or flee headlong and pray we reach the thin solace of civilization before it caught us. John's bellow shocked me from my fear-frosted paralysis. "Run! Back to the pickup now!" We crashed heedlessly through the underbrush, thorns and twigs lashing our flesh, breath sobbing in our throats. Behind us, drawing closer with each passing second, that hellish howling rose and fell in a frenzy of bloodlust. The rattle of the truck's engine sounded sweeter than any angel's hymn as we threw ourselves into the cab. John jammed it into gear, and we tore down the rutted track in a hail of gravel and flying mud. In the side mirror, just before we whipped around a bend and lost sight of it, I glimpsed a flash of something erupting from the tree line. Something tall and spindly and unspeakably fast. Something with the grinning rictus of a fleshless skull. Something with antlers. The pickup barreled down the logging road, frame shuddering as the hellishly thick woods blurred on either side. For a moment, I dared hope we might make it, might outpace the unnatural entity that hungered for our blood. But no sooner had the thought formed than a massive figure lunged from the trees ahead, directly into our path. John wrenched the wheel, but it was already too late. An impact like a freight train slammed into the truck's flank. The world pinwheeled crazily as we rolled once, twice, shearing through the brush in a scream of crunching metal and shattering glass. I felt a sickening weightlessness, a hot slash of pain, and then a crushing darkness rose up to whelm me under its silent tide. I swam groggily back to consciousness some interminable time later, my mind a tattered scrapbook of blood and terror. Blinking away the pain drumming in my skull, I looked around and nearly choked on my own pounding heart. The truck was crumpled around me like a discarded beer can. The other rangers strewn around me like rag dolls, their bodies bent at angles nature never intended. The air was murky and fluid, saturated with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid stink of leaking gasoline. And lurching out of the swirling mist, not 20 yards away but approaching steadily, was the thing that had run us to ruin. The skeletal homunculus from my fever dreams, the entity that had imprinted its vile sigil on scraps of discarded parchment. It towered a good 8 feet tall, its hide scabbed with moss and livid with wheals. Baleful corpse light danced in its empty eye sockets, and the antlers crowning its skull-like head twisted in mind-bending fractals. It couldn't be real, my short-circuiting mind insisted. It was impossible. A fever dream born of overwork and a surfeit of ghost stories. But the deep-seated animal panic filling my gut knew better. This thing, this affront to natural law, this cosmic blasphemy. It was real as the blood in my mouth and the scream building in my throat. Slowly, almost gently, the creature bent and seized Deputy Hank's limp form, hoisting him as effortlessly as a child with a kitten. Hank's eyes snapped open and he shrieked, a high and terrible sound, as those skeletal claws dug into his flesh. That scream pierced the shock that had me in its thrall. Ignoring the howling protest of abused nerves and muscle, I kicked open the crumpled door and tumbled from the wreckage, my duty pistol somehow already in my hand. Not that I had any illusions the weapon would do more than inconvenience the grim fiend. But by God, I was a ranger, and I wouldn't go to my grave without at least the token show of resistance. If I was to be a snack for the unnatural, I'd make sure to give the hell-spawned bastard indigestion. I took aim at the center of that grinning, bony mask, the revolver bucking and kicking in my sweat-slick grip. Once, twice, 3 times, the shots echoing away between the vine-cloaked trees, like Judgment's own trumpets. To my amazed horror, the 357 slugs punched fist-sized holes right through the thing's torso, and healed over almost immediately, the edges of shattered bone and blasted gristle knitting together as I watched in repulsed fascination. It was as if the creature's physical form was a thought rather than a fact, mutable by its unclean will alone. But if my attack hadn't harmed the horror, it had certainly gotten its attention. Dropping Hank's mauled form, it swung its Stygian gaze to me and let out a roar that shook the leaves from the trees, a sound of fury and dark joy. Then it was coming for me, bounding across the loam in great loping strides, its gnarled limbs blurring with unspeakable speed. I steadied my aim and prepared to fire my last defiant shots, determined to die on my feet. But before I could squeeze the trigger, the darkness took me. Not the oblivion of unconsciousness, but a sudden, unnatural absence of light. It was as if the sun and moon had been snuffed out, leaving only a cloying, clammy blackness. The roar of my own pulse in my ears was soon drowned out by a susurration of rustling movement all around me, the dry whisper of something moving through the forest floor detritus. Something cold and sharp snagged my ankle, yanking my feet from under me. My head hit the dirt with a sickening thud. Dazed, I felt more clammy tendrils winding around my legs, my waist, my neck, hoisting me bodily into the air. Hot, fetid breath washed over my face, and I nearly gagged. I was suspended in front of the creature's fleshless skull, its empty eye sockets boring into mine, a dark intelligence glittering in those lightless pits. "Fool," it hissed, its voice the crackle of old parchment and the seep of ancient bogs. "You dare much to strike at me. Your kind are even stupider than I recalled." I could only gurgle in response, the coils around my throat submerging me in a red sea of agony. "You will not die. Not yet." I could hear the smile in its voice, a dreary, mirthless rasp. "First, you will serve. You will scribe my words, bear witness to my return. And then, when the stars are right..." The tendrils constricted, and I felt a rib crack. I screamed or tried to, the exertion painted across my darkening vision. Well, even an insect can be useful, in the proper. The flash was blinding, a bolt of pure actinic grief erupting from the gloom behind my captor. It struck the creature square in its bony back and clung there, crackling and spitting like downed power line. The thing shrieked, a sound of shock and fury, and the tendrils binding me withered. I dropped to the fetid loam like a sack of meat. Gasping, I raised my head in time to see a second brilliant lance of pallid energy stab from the darkness and punch clean through the abomination's torso in an arc of sparks and flaming ichor. Squealing like a stuck pig, the creature spun to face its assailant. There, striding from the gloom, was a figure both strange and oddly familiar. A tall, rangy man, clad in a long duster and a wide-brimmed hat. Mist curled from the glowing runes etched along the barrel of the massive pistol he leveled at the antlered horror. "Back to the pit that spawned you," the newcomer growled. His voice was like gravel and grave dirt, but there was a note of iron resolve in it that kindled a faint ember of hope in my chest. "You'll not have this one, you bark-gnawing bastard." The creature screeched its defiance, but I could see the uncertainty in the hitch of its slumping shoulders, the backward shuffle of its hooves. Whoever this man was, whatever eldritch weaponry he wielded, the monster feared him. It spat a curse in some guttural tongue that turned my gorge, then bounded away into the fog-choked glades, its ululating howls fading into the gloom. In moments, the forest was silent and still once more, as if the abomination had never been. The tall man turned to face me, his pistol already holstered beneath his coat. In the pale light, I saw that his face was deeply lined below his scuffed hat, his beard streaked with ash gray, but his eyes were bright and sharp as flensing knives as he stared down at my battered form. "On your feet, Ranger," he said gruffly, extending a calloused palm. "No time to grab a siesta. You've work to do before the long, dark falls." Gingerly, dizzy with pain and confusion, I took his hand and let him haul me upright on watery legs. My mind spun, questions clotting my tongue. Who was he? What in the name of all that was holy had that thing been? What did it want with me? What work did I have to do? But before I could choke out a word, the mysterious gunslinger held up a quelling hand. "Plenty of time for questions later," he said, as if privy to my churning thoughts. "For now, just know this. You have looked upon what should not be, and in so doing, have marked yourself. The Antlered One has chosen you, for purposes I cannot guess. But know that it will be back for you. It is inevitable, fixed like the stars in their courses." I shivered, nausea churning in my gut. But beneath the fear, a stubborn ember of anger and defiance kindled. "Like hell," I croaked, my voice a ruined rasp. "I won't be a pawn in that thing's game. I'll fight it with my last breath." To my surprise, the man threw back his head and laughed, a sound like a rusted hinge. "I believe you might at that. Wouldn't have intervened otherwise. I've been watching you, Ranger. You're green as spring grass, but there's a spark in you, the same spark that drew me to this benighted stretch of nowhere all those years ago." He clapped me on the shoulder, nearly buckling my knees. "But you'll need more than pluck and a pistol where we're headed, boy. If you aim to beat the Antlered One at its own game, deny it the foothold it craves in our reality, you'll need to learn the hidden ways, the old crafts, and for that, you need a teacher." He turned to stride back into the mist-shrouded trees, his long coat flapping. After a few paces, he glanced back over his shoulder. "Well, you coming? Time's wasting and the shadows grow long." I stared at his retreating form for a long, befuddled moment, the events of the last few minutes replaying in my mind in all their awful glory. I was bruised, bloodied, and bedeviled. My certainties crumbled to dust, the tattered veil of my reality ripped asunder. The sane thing, the safe thing, would be to turn my back on this hidden world of horrors, to bury my head in the sands of blessed ignorance, to run back to the life I knew, however bleak and banal it might be. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew I couldn't do it. I was changed, marked, like the man said, by what I had seen and survived. There was no unknowing the truth, no return to a reality not poisoned by the dark. And if the antlered one truly had designs on me, some destined purpose for my unwilling flesh, I knew it would be back. It would hound me unto the very gates of hell. Running would only postpone the inevitable. No, if I was to have any hope of reclaiming my fate, of ripping it from the clutches of the unclean thing that sought to claim me, I would have to stand and fight. To learn the secret ways of this darksome world, and hopefully find some means of breaking my occult shackles. And God help me. But this mysterious gunslinging stranger seemed to be offering me a way to do just that. Sighing, I retrieved my miraculously undamaged service revolver from where it had fallen and limped off after my new mentor, into the crepuscular murk that shrouded the forest. As I followed him into the unknown, one final burst of lunatic humor escaped my cracked lips, a wheezing parody of a laugh. I thought I had come to these woods to escape my past, to find myself. But it seemed I'd found something else instead, something far older and hungrier. My name is Ethan Walters. I'm a park ranger. Those words, once a statement of purpose, now felt like the setup to a bitter cosmic joke. But as I forged on into the gloom, I amended the thought. I'm a park ranger, but I'm also so much more. I'm a hunter now too, a slayer, and my prey awaits. Again, my new mentor, John Ryder, he'd called himself, barked. I groaned, every muscle protesting as I hauled myself off the damp forest loam for what felt like the 100th time. We'd been at it for hours, Ryder putting me through a grueling regimen of calisthenics, weapons drills, and hand-to-hand training, interspersed with terse lectures on the unnatural entities that prowled the shadowed corners of the world. Remind me again why this is necessary? I grumbled, brushing leaf litter from my jeans. I thought you were going to teach me magic, not run me into the ground. Ryder snorted. Magic? That's a child's word for it. What I'm teaching you, what you need to learn, is the art. The craft of will and sacrifice, of blood and breath and bone. And believe you me, boy, you'll need a strong body and a disciplined mind to wield it. He tossed me a canteen. I drank deep, the lukewarm water soothing my parched throat. The antlered one and its ilk, they ain't some two-bit back alley thugs you can spook off with a stern word and a flash of tin, Ryder continued. They're old, powerful. To face 'em, you need to be a weapon, honed in body, mind, and spirit. I sighed, recapping the canteen. He was right, of course. After the horror in the woods, the glimpse I'd gotten of the squirming, suppurating truth behind the thin veneer of reality, I knew I'd need every scrap of strength and skill I could muster just to survive, let alone to fight back. All right, I said, squaring my shoulders. What's next? Ryder smiled thinly. Next, we see if there's any talent in you for the hidden ways. Time for your first lesson in the art proper. He led me to a small clearing carpeted in moss and lichen-crusted stones, the trees crowding close as if to shield us from prying eyes. From a pocket of his long duster, he produced a scrap of yellowed parchment covered in dense, spidery script and strange, unsettling diagrams. This, he said, is a ward. A basic weaving meant to turn aside the hungry eyes of the things that lurk in shadow. Study it, commit it to memory. But more than that, try to feel it, the shape and texture of it, the way it warps the skein of creation around it. I took the parchment, frowning at the cryptic markings. At first glance, they were nothing more than ink scratches, devoid of meaning. But as I stared at them, letting my eyes unfocus, I began to sense something. a pattern beneath the chaos, a logic as cold and inhuman as the vacuum between the stars. I think I feel it, I murmured. It's like the world suddenly has a third dimension I never noticed before. Like the air has weight and color and meaning. Ryder nodded. Good. You're glimpsing the true shape of things, the hidden currents of creation. The art is the act of seeing those currents and learning to direct them, to swim rather than be swept away. He gestured at the parchment. That ward is a simple pattern, a mote of stability imposed on the malleable essence of the world. With practice, you'll learn to craft your own patterns, to weave your will into reality as easy as breathing. I swallowed hard, a sudden weight settling on my shoulders. This was real. This was happening. I was being initiated into some ancient eldritch mystery cult, learning the secret ways of magic and monsters. It was exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. But, Ryder's voice cut through my racing thoughts. The art exacts a price. Every working, every weaving, it costs. Some more than others. And not just in blood or sweat or precious reagents. It costs a piece of you, of your humanity. Wield the art too recklessly, rely on it too heavily, and soon you'll be as much a monster as the horrors you hunt. I met his gaze, saw the somber warning in those flinty eyes. Is that what happened to you? I asked quietly. Is that why you live out here on the fringes? For a moment I thought I'd overstepped, that Ryder would shut down or lash out. But to my surprise, he just sighed, a sound of bone-deep weariness. I've made mistakes, he said slowly. Sacrificed things I shouldn't have. People I shouldn't have. All in the name of the hunt, of holding back the dark a little longer. I aim to spare you those mistakes if I can. He clapped me on the shoulder. But that's a lesson for another day. For now, focus on the ward. Practice tracing it, not just with your fingers, but with your mind. Get a feel for the currents, the flow of energy. We'll make a warden of you yet, boy. And so I sat, cross-legged on the loamy earth, the strange parchment balanced on my knees. As the forest darkened toward twilight and the first pale stars glimmered in the purple sky vault above, I immersed myself in the eldritch geometries, the non-Euclidean lines and impossible angles of the ward. It was grueling, maddening work, trying to force my mind into shapes it was never meant to assume. More than once I felt the edges of my sanity fray, felt the yawning abyss of lunacy beckon. But always, just when I thought I might shatter, Ryder was there, a steadying hand on my shoulder, an anchor in the howling chaos. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning in that hushed glade, reality itself seeming to warp and twist around the arcane patterns I wove. But finally, as a ghostly moon rose over the spectral trees, I felt something shift, some inner barrier crumbling away. The ward flared to sudden actinic life on the moldering parchment, its lines blazing with otherworldly energy. I felt it then, truly felt it, the way it pinched and puckered the fabric of space-time, the way it shunted the ravenous gazes of the dark things scrabbling at the edges of the world. I did it, I whispered, my voice hoarse with exhaustion and exultation. I actually did it. Ryder smiled, a fierce, feral expression. You're damn right you did. Congratulations, Ranger. You've just taken your first step into a wider, wilder world. He turned to gesture at the night-swathed woods around us. A world of wonders and horrors, of beauty and terror beyond mortal ken. A world that needs men like us, now more than ever. His gaze bored into mine, stripping me soul bare. So what do you say, Ethan Walters? You ready to embrace your destiny? Ready to stand against the hungry dark? I met that intense stare with a level, adamantine look of my own. the ward still flickering between my hands. In that moment, I felt the last of my old life, my old self, slough away like a shed skin. I was a ranger, yes, but I was also something new, something more. I was a warden, a hunter in the shadows, a light against the encroaching gloom. "I'm ready," I said simply. "Where do we start?" Ryder's smile widened, a slash of white in the moon-dappled dark. "Where else?" he asked, rising to his feet with the boneless grace of a born predator. "With the hunt." He turned to melt into the tree line, his long coat swirling. After a moment, I rose to follow, the ward clutched tight in my fist like a talisman against the night. As I slipped into the waiting woods, I couldn't suppress a shiver, a primal tremor of fear and exhilaration. I was crossing a threshold, I knew, leaving behind the safe, sane world of light and reason for a darker, stranger realm. But with each step, each crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots, that fear ebbed, replaced by a rising tide of resolve, of grim purpose. The antlered one was still out there, still fixed on claiming me for its own ineffable ends. But it would not find me easy prey, not anymore. I had taken my first steps on the hidden paths, the secret ways. I had touched the intangible, tasted the arcane. And though the road ahead promised to be long and dark and treacherous, I knew I would walk it to the end. For I was a warden now, and I had monsters to hunt. The trees crowded close as Ryder led me deeper into the shadowed heart of the forest, the moonlight filtering through the canopy in wan, sickly shafts. The night air was heavy and still, thick with the loamy reek of decay, and the only sounds were our muffled footfalls and the occasional skitter of unseen things in the undergrowth. I followed close on Ryder's heels, my senses straining against the gloom, the warden's ward a comforting weight in my pocket. Despite my exhaustion, despite the dull ache of overworked muscles, I felt strangely exhilarated, alive in a way I hadn't been in years. It was as if a veil had been ripped away, revealing the world in all its terrible, transcendent glory. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice hushed. "What are we hunting?" Ryder glanced back at me, his eyes glinting in the dimness. "There's been signs," he said cryptically. "Omens and portents, whispers on the wind. Something stirring out here, something old and hungry and malevolent." He ducked under a low-hanging branch, his coat snagging on the rough bark. "As for what it is exactly, I ain't rightly sure, but I aim to find out, and put it down, if need be." I swallowed hard, a sudden chill prickling up my spine. "And you think I'm ready for that? To face whatever this is?" Ryder barked a laugh. "Hell no, you ain't ready. No one's ever really ready first time out. But you got potential, kid. I saw it in the way you took to the ward, the way you opened yourself to the art. You're a natural, even if you don't know it yet." He paused, turning to face me fully. In the spectral light, his weathered face was a mask of shadow and angles, his eyes twin pits of darkness. "But this ain't gonna be no cakewalk, understand? What we're hunting, it's gonna be smart, and vicious, and utterly inhuman. It ain't gonna play by our rules. Ain't gonna have any mercy or morality as we understand it." He jabbed a finger at my chest. "So you gotta be ready, in here. Ready to do whatever it takes, to cross lines you never thought you'd cross. Because out here, in the wild places, it's kill or be killed. Hesitate, flinch, and you're dead. Or worse." I met that fathomless gaze, my jaw clenching. "I understand," I said quietly. "I didn't come this far to back down now. I'm in this, for better or worse." Ryder held my stare for a long, searching moment, then nodded. "Good. Hold on to that resolve. You're gonna need it." He turned and forged on into the brush, and I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Deeper and deeper we went, into the primal gloom, until it felt like the whole world had fallen away. leaving only the forest, ancient and enigmatic and full of watchful eyes. Time seemed to blur and stretch, minutes bleeding into hours, hours into some dreamlike eternity. Just when I thought we must surely have crossed over into some other world, some fairy realm of shadow and mist, Ryder held up a hand, bringing us to a sudden halt. "There," he breathed, pointing. "Look." I followed his gaze, squinting into the inky murk. At first I saw nothing but the endless ranks of trees, their trunks pale as bones in the moonlight. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A flicker of movement, a deeper darkness against the night. It was humanoid, but only in the loosest sense. A gaunt, elongated figure that seemed to unfurl from the shadows themselves, all emaciated limbs and tattered rags. Its head was a featureless oval, smooth and blank as an eggshell, but I could feel the weight of its eyeless gaze, the hunger that rolled off it in palpable waves. What is it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "A hollow," Ryder murmured. "A shade, a revenant. The empty husk of a soul long lost to the dark." He reached into his coat, drawing out a long, wicked-looking knife, its blade glinting with eldritch runes. "They're drawn to pain, to suffering. They feed on it, use it to sustain their existence. And this one, it's old and powerful. I can feel it from here." The hollow drifted closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette dancing on unseen strings. As it neared, I saw that its rags weren't rags at all, but tattered strips of mummified flesh clinging to yellowed bones. Ryder stepped forward, putting himself between me and the advancing abomination. "Stay back," he warned. "This ain't gonna be pretty." The hollow lunged, its movements blurring, far faster than any creature of flesh and bone. But Ryder was faster still. He sidestepped the grasping claws, his knife flashing in a glittering arc. Black ichor sprayed, sizzling where it struck the leaves, and the hollow let out a shrill, ululating cry that set my teeth on edge. Back and forth they danced, the warden and the wraith, trading blow for blow, darting in and out of the shadows. Ryder was a blur of motion, his blade seeming to be everywhere at once. But the hollow was relentless, shrugging off wounds that would have felled any mortal creature. I watched, transfixed and horrified, my hand clutching the ward in my pocket like a talisman. Part of me longed to help, to join the fray, but I knew I'd only get in the way. This was Ryder's fight, his element. And then, in a move almost too swift to follow, the warden slipped inside the hollow's guard, his knife ramming up under its ribcage. The thing convulsed, ichor gushing from the wound, and Ryder bore it to the ground, pinning it there like a bug on a card. "Back to the abyss with you," he snarled. "Back to the nothing that spawned you." He twisted the knife, and the hollow spasmed, its limbs thrashing. Then, with a final rattling sigh, it went limp, its form crumbling away into wisps of shadow and oily smoke. Ryder stood, breathing hard, ichor dripping from his blade. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You see now?" he asked grimly. "You see the kind of thing we're up against?" I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. I had thought I'd understood, thought I'd grasped the gravity of this hidden world, the stakes of the warden's calling. But seeing it in action, witnessing firsthand the raw, primal brutality of it, it shook me down to my core. Are they all like that?" I asked hoarsely. "The things we hunt?" Ryder shook his head. "Some are worse," he said simply. "Some are smarter, stronger, more twisted. The hollow, it was just a shade, an echo. The real horrors, the true abominations, they're still out there." He met my gaze, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Still think you're ready for this, Ranger? Still think you got what it takes?" I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. The fear was still there, coiled in my gut like a cold serpent. But there was something else now, too, rising up to meet it. A spark, a flame, kindled in the depths of my being. A fierce, unquenchable need to stand against the darkness, to safeguard the fragile light of the world, no matter the cost. "I'm ready," I said, and my voice was steel and fire. "I'm with you, Ryder, to the end." The warden held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded, something like approval in his eyes. "All right then," he said, sheathing his knife. "Let's get moving. The night's still young, and the hunt's just begun." He turned and melted back into the shadows, and I followed, my heart pounding in time with my footsteps, my soul alight with a grim, exultant purpose. I was a warden now, baptized in blood and darkness, and I had miles to go before I'd sleep. The days blurred together as Ryder put me through my paces, each lesson harder and more harrowing than the last. He drilled me in the esoteric arts of warding and binding, of hex and glyph and sigil. He taught me to listen to the whispers of the trees, to taste the tang of magic on the wind, to see the hidden world that pulsed and eddied beneath the skin of reality. And always, there was the hunt. Ghouls and ghostlights, revenants and redcaps. We tracked them through darkling woods and fog-shrouded fens, across moonlit moors and through crumbling cobwebbed ruins. Some fell to Ryder's flashing blades, some to my faltering first workings of the art. But with each victory, each notch carved in the warden's weathered staff, I felt myself growing stronger, surer, more attuned to the secret rhythms of this shadow world. Yet even as I embraced my new calling, even as I threw myself into the warden's work with all the fierce focus I'd once reserved for my ranger duties, I couldn't shake the specter that loomed over it all. The antlered silhouette that stalked the edges of my thoughts. The memory of bone-white branches and fathomless eyes. The horned one. My destined foe. The architects of my fate. It was out there still, I knew, weaving its webs, spinning its snares, waiting for me, in the blackest hollows of the wood. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that our paths would cross again. That all of this, the training, the hunting, the slow unfolding of my arcane potential, was only prologue to that final, fateful confrontation. It was a thought that filled me with dread, but also, if I was honest, with a strange, shivery thrill. A dark anticipation, like the charge in the air before a storm. For in the warden's world, there was no higher calling, no greater glory than to pit one's will and skill against the most terrible of foes. To stare into the abyss and see it blink first. And so I trained, and I studied, and I hunted. Honing myself, body and mind and spirit, into a weapon fit to face the coming dark. Ryder was a hard master, unsparing in his criticism, relentless in his expectations. But I met him at every turn, matched him steel for steel and grit for grit. I had to. For all our sakes. For the sake of the light, and all who walked beneath it, unknowing of the horrors that lurked just beyond the firelight's edge. But even in the midst of that grim work, there were moments of, if not levity, then at least a certain wild gallows humor. A camaraderie forged in blood and shadow, the bond of those who walk the knife's edge together. Like the night we hunted a particularly wily pack of werkin through the moonlit brush, their howls echoing off the mossy trunks. We'd finally run them to ground in a bramble-choked deadfall, and as we stood over the steaming, silver-pierced corpses, catching our breath, Ryder clapped me on the shoulder with a rusty chuckle. "Not bad, kid," he rasped. "You're learning. Couple more years, you might even be half as good as you think you are." I snorted, wiping ichor from my blade. "Careful, old man. Couple more years. You might need me to haul your arthritic ass out of the fire." He cuffed me upside the head, but he was grinning as he did it. A flash of yellowed teeth in the darkness. Mouthy whelp. Remind me to teach you some respect, next chance I get. You can try, I shot back, sheathing my knife with a flourish. Bring it on, Greybeard. And on we went, trading barbs and japes as we melted back into the trees, the werekin's blood still warm on our hands. It was a strange thing, that rough affection, that prickly camaraderie. A light in the dark, a bulwark against the howling void. In Ryder, I'd found more than a mentor, more than a brother in arms. I'd found a friend, the kind forged in the hottest fires, tempered in the sharpest trials, the kind that could face the abyss at your side and spit in its eye with a smile. But through it all, through the blood and the banter, the hard lessons and harder truths, the shadow of the Horned One loomed. I could feel its presence, its malign awareness, like a weight on the back of my neck, an itch between my shoulder blades. Waiting, watching, biding its time. I knew it was coming. Knew that all of this, all the sweat and strain and slow unfolding of arcane potential, was only preparation for that final, fateful reckoning. And as the days turned to weeks, the weeks to months, I found myself growing impatient, almost eager for that ultimate confrontation. To test myself against the abomination that had marked me, set its sights on my soul. Ryder sensed it, sensed the restless hunger growing in me. And one gray, guttering dawn, as we huddled over a meager fire in the depths of the forest, he finally voiced what we both knew was coming. "It's time," he said simply, his eyes glinting in the flickering light. "The signs are clear, the portents aligning. The Horned One, it's making its move." I sat up straighter, my heart kicking into a higher gear. "Where?" I asked hoarsely. "When?" Ryder shook his head. "Can't say for certain, but there's a power gathering, a darkness rising. I can feel it, like a storm on the horizon." He met my gaze, his face grim. "And at its center, the Horned One waits. For you." I swallowed hard, my hand straying to the hilt of my knife. "Then I won't keep it waiting any longer," I said quietly. "I'm ready, Ryder. As ready as I'll ever be." The old warden held my gaze for a long moment, searching, evaluating. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Aye," he rasped. "I reckon you are, at that." He reached out, clasped my shoulder in a grip like iron. "But you listen to me, boy, and you listen well. What you're facing, it's like nothing you've ever known. Nothing either of us has ever known." His fingers dug into my flesh, his eyes boring into mine. "There's every chance you won't walk away from this. Every chance that this is a one-way trip, a march into the mouth of hell itself. You understand that? You ready to shoulder that burden? Pay that price?" I didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. I met that flinty gaze with a level one of my own, my jaw set, my resolve unwavering. "I understand," I said, my voice low and fierce. "I knew what I was signing up for the moment I followed you into these woods. Knew there'd be no going back, no second chances." I leaned forward, the firelight dancing in my eyes. "The Horned One chose me for a reason, marked me as its own. And now I choose to mark it right back." Ryder stared at me a moment longer, his face unreadable. Then slowly, a grin split his weathered features, a savage, feral thing, all teeth and tightly leashed violence. "That's my boy," he growled. "That's the ranger I trained, the warden I forged." He released my shoulder, sat back on his haunches. "All right then, no sense waiting around for the hammer to fall. We move at dusk, follow the signs, track the rising dark to its source. And then..." He trailed off, his eyes distant, fixed on some far horizon only he could see. "And then," I finished for him, my voice a whisper of steel and shadow. "We finish this, once and for all." Ryder's grin widened, a slash of white in the gathering gloom. "Aye," he said softly. "Once and for all." The fire popped and hissed, the embers swirling up into the darkening sky. And in their fitful light, I saw the path ahead unspooling, a black ribbon winding into the heart of the abyss. A path steeped in blood and terror, in madness and malice, and all the dark things that lurk in the shadow of the soul. But it was my path, the only path, and I would walk it to the end, wherever it led. For good or ill, for weal or woe, the Horned One and I were bound now, our fates entangled like thorns in a briar patch. There would be no peace, no respite, until one of us fell. And by all the powers of earth and sky, by all the fire in my blood and steel in my spine, I swore it would not be me. Not this day, not any day. We set out as the last light bled from the sky, following the eldritch spoor of the rising dark, the crawling itch of wrongness that skittered up the back of the neck and set the teeth to aching. Through gloaming woods we went, through mist-shrouded valleys and over wind-scoured ridges, deeper and deeper into the wild places, the thin places where the veil between worlds wore tattered and thin. Ryder took the lead, his eyes gleaming in the dusk, his every step sure and silent as a wolf on the prowl. I followed close behind, my heart a war drum in my chest, my every sense straining against the gloom. The Warden's wards burned cold against my skin, talismans against the hungry eye of the hern. But I knew they would only turn its gaze so long, only shield me from its hungry howl for so far. Sooner or later the Horned One would find me, would catch my scent on the wind and come for me, inexorable as the tide, implacable as the gallows. It was in its nature, after all, to hunt, to rend, to lay waste to all that dared defy it. And I had defied it to its face, called it out, challenged its claim on my soul. There would be a reckoning for that, red and raw and written in blood and bone and the screams of the dead. But I was ready. Ready as I'd ever be, shaped and sharpened on the whetstone of Ryder's mad wisdom, forged in the fires of my own resolve. I was a weapon now, honed to a killing edge, a warden of the wild places, a rook to the hern's blasphemous king, and I would see this game played out to the bitter end, see the board swept clean in a tide of ichor and ash. Through the night we went, and on into the gray, guttering dawn, following the signs and portents only Ryder could read. The spoor of hares running in panicked circles, the unseasonal shedding of stags' antlers, the trees all aligned in ominous patterns. Slowly, surely, we spiraled in on the dark heart of the forest, the whispering hollow where the shadows grew thickest, and even the wind muffled its voice in dread. And there, in a clearing ringed by twisted oaks and choked with bone-white brambles, we found it. The ritual site, the charnel ground, the place where the barriers between the worlds grew thin as gauze. The air was thick here, cloying, tasting of spoiled meat and sour copper, and the ground underfoot was spongy, saturated with a black and virulent essence that sucked at the boots like hungry mouths. In the center of the clearing, a great flat-topped stone jutted from the earth like an altar or a dolmen, its pitted surface crawling with profane runes that seemed to writhe and squirm in the corner of the eye. And atop that stone, scattered like offerings or sacraments, were the bones, scoured clean and sun-bleached, unmistakably human. Dozens of them, scores, arrayed in spiraling patterns that hinted at some mad, non-Euclidean geometry. Mother of God, I breathed, my throat tightening at the sheer, palpable wrongness of it all. Ryder, what is this place? A gateway, the old warden murmured, his voice bleak as salt wind. A thinning of the walls between the worlds. Here, the hern's power waxes strong, its grip on our reality growing tighter. He gestured at the spiraling bones with the point of his blade, his mouth a grim line. It's been preparing for this, gathering its strength, whetting its hunger on mortal flesh and innocent bone. biding its time, until its chosen quarry came within reach. He turned to face me then, his eyes glittering in the half-light. Until you came within reach, boy. You're the final piece, see? The last link in the chain, the blood tithe that will throw wide the gates and usher the hern into this world in all its savage glory. A mirthless grin split his face, more a rictus than a smile. That is, if you let it. If you bend the knee and bare your throat like a lamb to the slaughter. A growl rose in my throat, my fingers tightening on the hilt of my knife. Never, I grated out. It'll choke on my bones before I give it that satisfaction. I thought as much. Ryder's grin sharpened, a wolf's grin, all fangs and tightly leashed menace. So what say we spoil its feast, eh? Upset the altar and scatter the offerings, spit in its eye and dare it to do its worst. The blood was high in me now, thundering in my ears, and the wards burned against my skin like cold fire. I could feel it out there in the lightless hollows of the trees, the weight of the hern's gaze, the building pressure of its hunger, its hate. It knew I was here now, knew its chosen prey had come at last to the killing ground. I could all but taste its foul expectancy, its glee, and its black rage. Let's end this, I snarled, my voice scarcely my own. Let's cut the strings and break the webs. Let's send this antlered bastard howling back to the void that spawned it. Aye, Ryder growled, falling into a fighter's crouch. And may the old gods help us, because naught else will. As if his words were a summoning, a fetid wind gusted through the clearing, setting the branches to groaning and the bone chimes to clattering. The shadows deepened, darkened, drawing in on themselves like a beast crouching to spring. And there, at the edge of the clearing, the underbrush parted like a rotted curtain, and it stepped through. The horned one. The hern. My nightmare made manifest, my doom given flesh and form and terrible tearing fangs. It towered over us, twice the height of a man, its emaciated frame swathed in scraps of rotting fur and tattered hide. Its limbs were long and bony, tipped with jagged claws the length of short swords, and its barrel chest heaved with the effort of its breath, the reek of charnel pits and opened graves. But it was the head that drew the eye and chilled the blood, a monstrous, eyeless skull crowned with an ever-twisting tangle of antlers, their points sharp as spears and glistening with a viscous, venomous ichor. It swung that massive head from side to side, scenting the air, seeking me out. And when at last its eyeless sockets fixed on me, I felt a cold hand close around my heart, a black despair sink its fangs into my guts. This was a thing out of darkest dreams and most abysmal legend, a primal horror spawned in the black gulfs between the stars, and the reek of its malice, its cruel and avid hunger, struck me like a hammer blow. But I stood my ground, even as my knees ached to buckle, my bladder to void itself. I'd sworn an oath, sworn it in blood and shadow, and I would not break now, not with the end so near. Blade in hand and wards burning bright, I faced my nightmare, snarling back at its eyeless gaze. Beside me, Ryder braced to spring, teeth bared in a devil's grin. "Come on then, you whoreson bastard," he roared, his voice ringing in the blackness. "Come get your guts in a pile." The hern threw back its head and bellowed, the sound shattering trees, a shockwave of pure malice. Then, moving with terrible blurring speed, it charged, its claws scything, antlers lowered to impale. I dove aside, hitting the ground in a shoulder roll, as those claws ripped furrows in the ground where I'd stood. Lurching to my feet, I lunged in low, my knife blade flashing for the hern's legs, seeking tendon and artery. But quick as I was, the beast was quicker, an eye blink ahead of me. It danced back, unnaturally nimble for its hulking size, black ichor sizzling where my blade scored its hide. Grinning its death's head grin, it beckoned me on, daring me to come at it again. And I did, roaring my defiance, all fear forgotten in the rush of battle joy. We met like stags in rut, clashing and rebounding and clashing again, the hern's furnace breath hot on my face, its skull visage filling my world. Behind it, all around it, Ryder darted and wove, his blade a silver flicker, scoring its hide, spilling its sour ichor. Whenever its clawed hands lashed out at him, he slipped their grasp like an eel, taunting it, mocking its sloth even as he opened it, throat to belly. And yet, for all the savagery of our onslaught, for all the wounds we rained on its ravaged corpus, the hern fought on undaunted. Black blood painted it head to hoof, its matted fur hung on it in ragged strips, but its strength only seemed to grow, its hideous vigor to swell. Even as we drove it back across the forest floor, staggering it, hammering it to its knees, I knew the bitter truth. We were outmatched here, outclassed. The hern was a force of nature, an elemental thing, as much a part of these benighted woods as the trees themselves. And we were just two fragile men of blood and bone and breakable flesh. But gods, we made it bleed for every inch. Made it pay in pain for every crunch of shattered rib, every glob of tar-thick ichor that spattered the ground. Howling our war cries until our throats were raw, we fell on it like wolves on a wounded bear, desperate to pull it down before it could regain its balance, desperate to deal the killing blow before our own strength gave out. And we almost did. Almost had it. Sprawled in the mast and muck, Ryder on its back with his arms locked around its neck, me on its chest with my blade angled under its ribs for the heart thrust. I stared up into that fleshless face, into the black and burning pits of its eyes, and grinned a feral grin as I tensed to drive the knife home. For all the lost, I snarled through gritted teeth. For all the damned, this is for them, you son of a bitch. But even as I drew back to strike, the hern rallied. Rearing up with a roar that shook the earth, it caught Ryder a backhand blow that sent him sprawling into the brambles, his blade skittering away into the dark. An instant later, its claws found me, closed on me, those dagger digits sinking through jerkin and shirt to pierce my flesh beneath. I howled as it hauled me off my feet, shaking me like a rat, a red mist of agony descending over my eyes. Gods, the pain, like cold fire, like molten lead, searing my nerves to ash, my mind to gibbering ruin. Dimly, through the haze of torment, I felt it throw me, felt the sickening weightlessness, the gut-wrenching impact as I slammed into the dolmen stone. Something cracked inside me as I struck, a bright starburst of fresh anguish, and the world swam out of focus, narrowing to a blur of black and red. I scrabbled weakly at the stone, trying to pull myself upright, but my limbs wouldn't obey, my body a distant, shattered thing. From what seemed an infinitesimal distance, I heard Ryder screaming my name, heard the clash of steel on talon as he hurled himself back into the fray. But it was a losing battle, and we both knew it. The hern had us now, at its non-existent mercy. It was only a matter of time. I slipped in my own blood as I struggled to rise, to force my battered carcass back into the fight. And my hand fell on something hard and cold. Dragging my head around, I beheld one of the altar's grim offerings. A human thigh bone, long and heavy, still stained with the blood of its previous owner. A desperate thought kindled in my stunned brain, a last-ditch hope. Even as the hern bore down on me, its skull face alight with terrible glee, I closed my fingers around the grisly cudgel and heaved myself upright to meet it. And as that antlered nightmare towered over me, as its talons flashed down to rend and eviscerate, I swung the thigh bone with all my remaining strength, feeling the impact judder up my arm as it cracked against the hern's bony brow. The beast reeled back, more surprised than hurt, a chunk of yellowed skull flying into the darkness. And in that instant, I pressed my advantage. Lurching inside its guard, I brought the bone down again and again, aiming for the orbits, the nasal cavity, the gaping cage of its teeth. Bone met bone with a crunching, splintering retort, and the hern howled, clawing at its shattered visage, black ichor spraying. Beside me, Ryder saw his chance. snatching up a fallen pine branch as thick as a man's arm. The old warden put his shoulder behind it and rammed the jagged end into the hern's belly like a spear. It punched through the rotting hide in an explosion of fetid gore, skewering the beast, staggering it back. Ryder leaned into the improvised pike, barking a laugh as he used it to force the hern to its knees, all that terrible strength pouring out of it in a tide. Now, I thought dimly, my blood-soaked fingers tightening on my macabre mace. Gods, let it be now, before it can muster itself for another charge. Gathering the last crumbs of my fading strength, I raised the thigh bone high and brought it down like a thunderbolt, square on the crown of the hern's head. The creature's skull shattered like a melon, chunks of yellowed bone and gobbets of black matter spraying, and it let out a sound I'll never forget. A high, keening wail, a cry of disbelieving anguish. It reared back, Ryder's branch slipping from its punctured gut, and slowly, ponderously, like a great tree finally yielding to the axe, it toppled backwards and crashed to the loam, its limbs twitching spasmodically, the eldritch light guttering out behind its eye sockets. Dead. It was dead. After all the fear, all the blood and agony, the horned one, the terror of the wild wood, lay dead at our feet, bested by desperate men with the most primitive of weapons. A ragged sob tore from my throat, halfway between a laugh and a moan, and my legs gave out. I sank to the mast beside Ryder, bleeding from a score of wounds, shaking with exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. The old warden put an arm around my shoulders, hauling me close, steadying me as the last of my strength bled away. You did it, Ethan. He rasped in my ear, fierce pride burning bright in his voice. You rang the bastard's bell, but good. I knew you had it in you, by all the old gods I knew. I leaned into him, turning my head to grin up at him with split and bloody lips. We did it, I croaked. You and me both, warden mine. Couldn't have done it without you. Ryder's grin flashed in the gloom, feral and joyous and full of savage light. No more than I could have done without you, boy. We're a matched pair, we are. A regular Tamlin and Janet, and no mistake. I coughed a laugh at the old, half-remembered tale, the story of the bold maiden who braved the wild wood to save her love from the fairy queen's cold clutches. It seemed oddly fitting in a strange way, a fable to match our desperate venture, our battle against a monster out of darkest legend. Tamlin and Janet, indeed, I murmured, letting my head loll back against Ryder's shoulder. A hell of a story, for one hell of a night. We sat like that for a long moment, just breathing, savoring the sweet air and the simple fact of our survival. Around us, the forest seemed to breathe easier too, a tension going out of the shadows, a freshening in the wind. It was as if the hern's fell influence was already fading, its power broken with its physical form. Finally wincing, I struggled to my feet, Ryder rising with me. Together, leaning on each other, we limped to the edge of the clearing and looked back at the scene of our victory. The shattered dolmen, the scatter of bones, the great dark bulk of the hern lying twisted in the mast. Even dead, it was a thing to inspire dread. But that dread was tempered now with a savage satisfaction, a primal joy in a great evil laid low. We should burn it, Ryder said quietly. Render the bones, scatter the ashes, make sure the bastard never comes back. I nodded wearily. Agreed, but let's see to our own wounds first, eh? I don't know about you, but I could use a stiff drink and a soft bed. Not necessarily in that order. Ryder snorted. A man after my own heart? All right, let's away. I know a place nearby, a safe haven warded and watched. We'll get patched up, and then, God's willing, we'll get righteously drunk. We've earned it and then some. Lead on then, Macduff, I quipped, sheathing my knife. And damned be he who first cries, hold, enough. And with that, we turned our backs on the shadow-haunted clearing, on the cooling corpse of an antlered nightmare, and hobbled off into the whispering wood, battered and weary, but alive. Alive and victorious. The Horned One was no more. And the wild places were a little safer, a little saner, thanks to Ryder and me. An old warden and a young ranger. Two unlikely heroes waging a war most would never know was fought. It was a strange destiny, a hard and bloody calling. But I knew, as the first pale light of dawn glimmered through the trees, that I wouldn't have traded it for the world. This was where I belonged, on the border between the tame lands and the untamed wilds, holding the line against the dark. After all, I was a warden now, and I had work to do.